Good evening. The battle for the Falklands is tonight entering a new phase. For a week, thousands of British troops have been consolidating their hold on one small corner of the islands. Today they began moving out, advancing towards Darwin and Goose Green, and eventually the big prize, the capital of the Falklands, Stanley. It's believed a parachute battalion met some opposition as they moved forward. But when Mrs. Thatcher told the Commons today the advance had begun, she gave no details.
The House would not expect me to go into details about the operations in progress, but our forces on the ground are now moving forward from the bridgehead.
Mrs. Thatcher warned the House against too much discussion of military operations. That helped the enemy and hindered the British forces, she said. As survivors from HMS Sheffield arrived home today, more details were being released of Tuesday's attack on the container ship Atlantic Conveyor. The ship is still afloat, and it's possible she may be salvaged. But the loss of life is higher than feared. Apart from the 4 dead reported yesterday, another 8 men are missing, including the captain. The ship was hit by an Exocet missile, and there's concern that Argentina may be trying to buy more Exocets. The American government is said to have begun providing the British task force with missiles and other weapons for use in the South Atlantic. In Buenos Aires, the Joint Chiefs of Staff claimed their Canberra bombers have been attacking the British beachhead on the Falklands and inflicting heavy casualties, but that's not been confirmed in London. Our defence correspondent Christopher Wayne looks at what's likely to be happening on the islands.
Mrs. Thatcher only gave a few tantalising hints about what's been going on, and the Defence Ministry are determined not to give away anything which might help the Argentines. It's believed that not very much information is reaching Buenos Aires from Port Stanley, and the Argentine commander, General Menendez, probably doesn't know the British order of battle. But it is becoming clear that the paratroops are driving south, while the commandos are enlarging the beachhead and heading east. The clashes started last night and have continued throughout the day. For Brigadier Julian Thompson, the British commander, the first problem has been to deal with the battalion of Argentines dug in around Darwin and Goose Green. Although the airfield there would be useful, it's the soldiers who need to be captured. The most practical way of dealing with them is probably by heavy shelling from the high ground to the north, then encirclement. General Menendez will have ordered them to fight to the last man, to give himself more time to prepare his defences around Port Stanley. At the same time, the commandos to the north of San Carlos Water are now thrusting east towards Port Stanley. At the moment, their job is to attack the Argentine observation posts dotting the northern coastline. Most of the movement is by helicopter. The helicopters are vital. RAF Chinooks can lift heavy items like 105mm guns to remote hilltops in no man's land. They take minutes when the same trip overland takes hours. But although the task force has a lot of helicopters, some were lost with the Atlantic Conveyor. So Brigadier Thompson has to make careful use of what's left. The Army's Scorpion light tanks are highly manoeuvrable over boggy ground, and they too can be airlifted. But like all armoured vehicles, they're vulnerable to ambush by anti-tank units. So at the moment, their role is limited to observing and plotting Argentine positions. Many of those positions have already been spotted by aerial reconnaissance, others from warships bombarding the Argentines. The ships will have been keeping up this harassing fire, if only to cover the expected second landing by troops who've arrived in the QE2. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has now formally accepted New Zealand's offer of the frigate Canterbury, which has arrived at Singapore. The frigate is now under Royal Navy control, and that means HMS Amazon, one of the 2 British frigates patrolling the Gulf of Oman, can now be sent down to the South Atlantic. That in turn means more missile protection for the task force. The missiles have been taking a heavy toll of Argentine warplanes. Last night, according to a communique from Buenos Aires, Argentine Canberra bombers made a night attack on the San Carlos beachhead. It was probably no more than a tip-and-run raid. And tonight, the Argentines, who seized the Falklands exactly 8 weeks ago, are apparently in combat with some of Britain's toughest troops.
The Ministry of Defence confirmed today that HMS Coventry has now sunk, and more details are emerging about how she was hit. Coventry destroyed 2 Argentine Skyhawks with Sea Dart missiles before she was struck by a bomb from a 3rd Skyhawk. An explosion and a fireball swept through the operations room. The ship listed to port, and the crew and wounded made their way to the upper decks, from where they were later rescued. The Defence Ministry hopes that some of the supplies on the Atlantic Conveyor can be saved. Of the 8 men still unaccounted for from the container ship, one of them is her master, Captain Ian North. Cunard described him today as a very fine master mariner. Peter Main reports.
Captain North had been master of Atlantic Conveyor for 3 years. He was the first to volunteer to sail in her to the South Atlantic, where she fell victim to an Exocet missile. The Defence Ministry say 2 were fired, only 1 struck home. All the Harriers on the vessel had already been flown off, and some of the helicopters and stores on board could be saved as well, because latest reports say Atlantic Conveyor is still afloat and upright. So, is there a chance she could be salvaged?
Yes, I suppose there is a possibility. I think when you talk of salvage, you've got to consider both aspects, both the ship and the cargo. And assuming that there is cargo on board and stores on board, that will be of value to the task force.
What sort of man is Captain North?
Well, I would say a remarkable man, probably the best known of all masters in the Cunard fleet, although you get very well-known masters on the passenger ships. He's a master who has probably been identified with more of our success stories and firsts, such as new ships, new developments, technical advances and that, and is very well known in the industry generally. And this is typified by the messages of sympathy which we've received from all over the world.
43 British merchant ships are now serving with the task force. Cargo vessels and tankers for fuel and water form a conveyor belt of supplies between Britain and the South Atlantic. 3 passenger ships have also been taken over for hospital and troop ships. P&O are one of the 4 companies who've supplied most of the vessels, although a whole range of shipping firms are involved. The operation is costing the government around £5 million a week and involves 2,000 people from the Merchant Navy. The QE2, requisitioned as a troop ship, is owned by Cunard, who also have Atlantic Causeway, sister ship to Atlantic Conveyor, serving in the South Atlantic. In view of recent events, might they and their crews be having second thoughts?
All I can say to you, there was a feeling on the Conveyor when she sailed, and I saw the ship out of Plymouth, of, well, you know, it may come to that. It was that sort of situation at the time. When the Atlantic Causeway sailed, which was about a fortnight ago, just over a fortnight ago, I think there was a greater awareness of the way that the situation had developed, certainly from the people that I spoke to on board. But no feelings other than that, you know, they were going to do their bit in this campaign.
It's been confirmed tonight that the United States is providing Britain with arms for the conflict in the Falklands. This includes more than 100 Sidewinder missiles, the main weapon of the Harrier jet. Few details have been given, presumably to avoid adding more strain to Washington's relations with Latin America. But as Martin Bell reports, there are plenty of supplies coming from America.
Help is on its way from the United States. Most of it is being delivered in some secrecy, but one item is known about. The oil rig repair ship's Tenor Inspector has been bought by the British and is being fitted out by the US Navy for service in the South Atlantic. It has a deep-sea diving capability and may be used for salvaging sensitive military equipment on sunken British warships. Beyond this, US administration officials confirmed today that in fulfillment of the pledge to give Britain material support, they have provided about 110 of the most modern Sidewinder missiles, the missiles being used by the Harrier jets in the South Atlantic campaign. The Americans have also provided some ammunition, but they didn't specify how much or go into any further details of arms supplies for fear of alienating still further the Latin Americans who, as it happened, were meeting in Washington today through the OAS in what was in effect a ganging up session against the United States. Mr. Costa Mendes was here to chide the British, but the Americans too, and to demand effective action from the Rio Treaty countries. The American Secretary of State was on hand, had asked to speak early, but this request was not granted, and instead he had to settle down and listen to a tide of anti-American rhetoric. Mr. Costa Mendes' interpreter caught the spirit of it.
We cannot fail to deplore the attitude of one of the states parties to this Rio Treaty, the security organ, and essential instrument which obligates the American states to defend the continent against external aggression.
Mr. Costa Mendes won his usual standing ovation from the claque of his supporters. Mr. Haig, when he speaks, by contrast, will be heard in a hostile and stony silence.
A hero's welcome today for the men of HMS Sheffield when they arrived at Brize Norton Air Base in Oxfordshire, 3 weeks after their ship was sunk in action off the Falklands. Francis Coverdale was among those meeting them.
After a 10-hour journey from the Ascension Islands, the survivors from HMS Sheffield were led down the steps of the VC-10 by their captain, Sam Salt. As he was greeted by Rear Admiral Robert Gherkin, the flag officer whose flotilla included the Sheffield, there was applause from waiting families and servicemen. Then the moment they'd all been waiting for as fathers, sons and husbands poured onto the tarmac. At last, the ordeal, which started 23 days ago with an Exocet missile which came out of the blue, was over. It was their first reunion in more than 6 months. Sheffield had been on her way home from the Middle East when she was diverted to join the task force. But although a private area had been set aside for them, some couldn't wait. At a news conference, Captain Salt spoke of their mixed feelings now they're back.
We have real happiness for being reunited with our families, and please remember we have been away as a ship from the UK since the 17th of November. We feel great sympathy for our families, or rather the families of those of our friends on board who lost their lives during the attack. We feel deep sorrow for the loss of our ship, for which we had great affection. We feel considerable anger that we were struck in the first place. We feel particularly frustration that we're not still fighting alongside the task force. And finally, we are of course deeply upset by the other losses that have occurred in the Falklands struggle since our own.
Families spoke of the last 3 weeks' ordeal and their joy at today's reunion.
I saw him walking across the window and I knew he couldn't see me. And I felt so happy, so pleased to see him again.
Donnie, you can't stop hugging your father, can you?
No, I can't. It's so wonderful to have him home. I can't really believe it, that he's actually sort of here in one sort of piece.
Of course, it was your birthday the day you heard that your father was safe.
Yes.
How did that news come to you?
Well, it was wonderful. It was a relief for all of us, but for me it was great because, you know, the night before when we heard of the Sheffield sinking, I thought, God, this is awful, you know, it's my birthday tomorrow and it's the lousiest birthday I've ever had, sort of thing. And then when we heard that it was alive and that, I couldn't stop sort of crying from happiness, really, not from sort of sadness. I was just so happy.
What was your immediate reaction when you realised that Sheffield had been hit?
I couldn't believe it. Quite honestly, I couldn't. It just happened so fast. There was an instant warning that it was going to happen, and then within seconds there was from where I was, it was a dull thud. There was fine smoke around immediately. From where I was, I went down below into the ship to try and get to my action station, and it was just thick black smoke. And that's why we all had to come back up onto the upper deck.
It was cold on the upper deck, and we didn't actually leave the ship until the captain thought that the ship was going to blow up. It was unreal. It was so unreal. I don't think many of us could believe it was actually happening to us at the time.
The 3 weeks it's taken us to get home has been at sea. We've been worried, etc., and just thinking of the family back home, how they were feeling at the time. But once we got on that plane at Ascension, I knew it was going to.
What do you think you'll be doing tonight?
Get a good night's sleep.
What did you manage to salvage off the boat itself?
A few jumpers.
Two jumpers.
Yes. All your personals are gone, eh?
Everything's gone, yeah.
263 men came back today to the welcome of their loved ones and the glare of publicity. That over, they made their way home to find peace and privacy. There'll be a lot to tell and time to tell it. One man, asked what he'd do tonight, said simply, "I'm going to be waited on."
Leading seaman Howard Martin was a sonar operator aboard the destroyer who nearly suffocated as fumes spread through the ship after the attack. This evening, the tragedy was all but forgotten. His friends and neighbours were just glad to see him alive.
Mr. Martin, can I ask you, how does it feel to be home?
It's tremendous. I can't put it into words. I'm overjoyed.
Were you expecting this kind of a welcome?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't. There's so many people in this road that are on the Sheffield, down in the South Atlantic. I didn't expect this.
Did you have any doubts about going back to sea?
Going back to sea? No. Going back down to the South Atlantic, yes.
Tonight, leading seaman Martin was planning to celebrate and looking forward to spending his leave with a wife and 2 children he hasn't seen for nearly 6 months.
The Royal Navy's been answering criticism that they take too long giving relatives and dependents information after radio and television broadcast news of sinkings and casualties. The Navy invited the BBC to see for itself the welfare operation it's mounted. Bruce Parker reporting.
This is the unglamorous room inside the shore establishment at HMS Nelson in Portsmouth, where casualty information comes from the fleet via the Northwood Naval Headquarters in Middlesex. Members of all 3 services man the telephones, and it's here that arrangements are made for welfare personnel to call on the families of both survivors and casualties. This afternoon, Mary Powell, who's a naval social worker, visited 2 wives who learned last evening that their husbands aboard HMS Coventry were safe. They were very happy about how they were kept informed, but a lot of wives are not. So why does the Navy on the ground appear to be so far behind announcements from the Ministry of Defence in London?
It happens because the Argentinians certainly are very good, as I think I've said before, and we all feel very good at rumour. And therefore, on one hand, you've got to try and do something to combat that. We've got a lot of media coverage, as you know, because you provide a lot of it. And therefore, there's that on one hand. We've also got the problem of protecting our own fleet, therefore there's security. And then we've got the other vitally important thing of getting in touch with our families. So those are the 3 problems, and it is often quite impossible to be able to resolve that to everyone's satisfaction. What I would say, above anything else, is that if we have time, then we can get in touch with people quickly, and information. We need hard information.
Military detectives on the requisitioned liner the QE2 are questioning troops aboard the ship about the murders of 2 Hampshire women earlier this month. The QE2 sailed 2 days after the 2 women, Mrs. Peggy Johnson and Mrs. Anne Lee, were stabbed to death while walking their dogs along a wooded lane on Army land in Aldershot. Other pictures recently received from the South Atlantic show Argentine prisoners on board the carrier Invincible after the sinking of the trawler Narwhal. The Royal Navy say it was acting as a spy ship. About a dozen of the crew were wounded. 1 who died was buried at sea. Their ship, a 1,000-ton trawler, was attacked and sunk by Harriers of the British Task Force nearly 3 weeks ago.
May Almighty God have mercy on us, pardon our sins.
This was 4 days after their rescue by Royal Navy helicopters. Code books and secret documents were found on board the trawler after she was attacked and boarded by the British Task Force. And there was, says the Royal Navy, at least 1 Argentine naval officer among the crew. They're now expected to be sent home to Argentina, probably by way of Montevideo in Uruguay. Argentina has increased its jamming of BBC radio programmes. A special programme beamed every night to the Falkland Islands is now being jammed. And to try to overcome the new interference, the BBC has doubled the number of shortwave frequencies carrying the programme. BBC broadcasts to Latin America have already been weakened because one of the 4 transmitters on Ascension Island was taken over earlier this month by the Ministry of Defence. This latest action will mean signals to the area, including Argentina, will be even weaker. In Buenos Aires, President Galtieri's government has rejected a message from President Reagan calling for closer relations. It was incomprehensible in the light of American support for Britain, he said. Meanwhile, military sources in Buenos Aires say they're engaged in fighting with British troops at the San Carlos beachhead, but neither side was gaining any advantage. From Argentina, Christopher Morris reports.
On the Falklands, Argentine soldiers are preparing for what's expected to be the decisive battle, the British attempt to recapture Port Stanley. They're an elite force of Marines, well-equipped, an estimated 4,000 of them altogether, whose task is to defend the island's capital against the British troops now poised for an attack at any time. They seem relaxed enough, but they're keenly aware that since Friday's landing at Port San Carlos, 50 miles away, British troops have now successfully advanced from their bridgehead and hold an area of 150 square kilometers. Just outside Port Stanley, the Argentine soldiers anxiously await the arrival of the British forces, and the battle, they know, will come soon. Other troops go out on regular helicopter patrols to try and halt any further British advance, but so far they've failed to slow down the march towards Port Stanley. So now, after what's being described here as Britain's naval disaster with the severe damage and loss of so many warships, the fighting has moved from the sea onto the islands themselves. But the three members of the military junta are apparently bitterly divided, accusing each other about what's gone wrong so far. The Commander-in-Chief of the Air Force complains his pilots have had to bear the brunt of the fighting. The Navy commander under attack because the Argentine warships in the main fleet have not yet fired a shot in anger against the British task force. And the President, who's Commander-in-Chief of the Army, criticised because his troops defending the islands failed to stop the British landing. General Galtieri, just back in Buenos Aires after visiting his troops in the south, is clearly worried about the British advance in the Falklands. At an hour-long meeting with Archbishop Silvestrini, the Pope's emissary, General Galtieri has repeated his hopes for a peaceful, honourable and just settlement. The meeting is seen as an attempt to avoid any charge of the Pope taking sides before his visit to Britain starting tomorrow. In 15 days' time, the Pope is due to visit Argentina as well. Outside the cathedral at Luján, where he'll hold a special mass for peace, the souvenir sellers already await the arrival of hundreds of thousands of Argentines. It'll be the Pope's first visit to Argentina. Anticipating that important occasion, the Pope's emissary came here to join the two Argentine cardinals just back from Rome, where they signed a declaration of reconciliation with British cardinals and bishops. The Pope will pray for peace in front of the Virgin of Luján, a place of pilgrimage for all Argentine Catholics. Yet on the cathedral walls are the trophies of war from Argentina's independence nearly 200 years ago. During their visit to Rome, the Argentine cardinals were apparently upbraided by the Pope for failing to take a stronger stand against the Argentine invasion of the Falklands. Now, however, their prayers are aimed at achieving the Pope's wish for a halt to the fighting and a peaceful settlement.
Last-minute preparations are underway in many parts of Britain for the arrival of the Pope early tomorrow morning. Perhaps the biggest rush will be at Wembley Stadium. Now that the Cup final replay is over, workmen are moving in to build a huge platform for the Mass, which the Pope will celebrate there on Saturday. There's been a great deal of hasty activity in Rome, too, as Kate Adey now reports.
In Rome this past week, the decision to go ahead with the visit to Britain has assumed greater importance than the visit itself. And it's no secret that a most un-Vatican-like scramble has been going on to finalize speeches, timetables, travel arrangements and protocol, all because that decision was delayed so long. Equally, the serene facade conceals flat-out diplomatic activity to explain the Pope's position in relation to Britain, Argentina and the Falklands. At the British Embassy, too, the diplomats have been beavering away to clarify Whitehall's position to the Italian media and watching the Vatican's political maneuverings with interest.
I think it was, looking at it politically, I think it was a very good thing to bring the Argentine bishops in, and it was very good that they should learn the problem. And they, I think, have understood a great deal better than before they came to Rome what it's all about. So I think this was well done, and now it appears to have had the desired effect. The visit will take place. And from the political point of view, the thing about the visit is that it would have been misinterpreted if it hadn't taken place. Therefore, I think all is for the best.
On the spiritual side, the English College in Rome is quietly celebrating something of a religious coup. It was pressure from the British cardinals and archbishops which finally convinced the Pope about the visit. It remains to be seen during the 6 days in Britain and the days in Argentina a week later, whether the Pope succeeds in dividing the pastoral from the political.
The Pope's arrival will be shown live on BBC One tomorrow morning, starting at 7:45. For the rest of the news, 4 women campaigning against nuclear weapons were arrested this afternoon after bailiffs arrived to demolish their so-called peace camp at Greenham Common near...
The Arrow, which is a Type 21 frigate, came right alongside Sheffield, and basically we stepped over.
Stepped over from one ship to the other in the South Atlantic?
From one warship to another. There were some terrific seamanship skills shown on that day by all the ships that came to our assistance, and there was some damage done to both ships in the actual manoeuvring to get alongside, but everybody managed just simply to walk over the side, apart from a very few people who had to be picked up by a helicopter a bit later.
HMS Sheffield, one of the Navy's most modern destroyers, was hit by an Exocet missile. One missile capable of destroying a ship. Sheffield had succeeded in her task of protecting the carriers, but only by taking the missile herself. The aircraft that launched it came in low, taking advantage of the fleet's lack of planes carrying airborne radar. They would have detected the intruder earlier. After 5 hours, the ship was abandoned to the fire. But Sheffield would not sink. After the fire had burned out, she was still there, shrouded in sea mist, but floating upright. Occasional wisps of steam came from the foredeck, where the survivors had gathered waiting to be rescued, and singing, "You've got to look on the bright side of life." The intense heat had charred and twisted the metal on the upper deck. The helicopter hangar on the stern was filled with ash. The paint had been stripped from the starboard side where the missile had penetrated. Flakes of it blew in the wind. The ship's engineering officer was winched down to see if she could be salvaged.
But HMS Sheffield did, in fact, sink another 3 days later.
At the United Nations, the Secretary-General's attempts at negotiating a ceasefire have been continued.
The British troop commander in the Falklands makes a dramatic radio appeal to the Argentine commander in Port Stanley. End the killing, lay down your arms. Home to a reunion with their families, survivors of the Atlantic conveyor sunk by an Argentine missile. President Reagan and his wife dine with the Queen tonight at Windsor Castle. Good evening. The Israelis have been claiming sweeping successes in their invasion of South Lebanon, but diplomatic efforts to get them to withdraw have been gaining strength. The Israelis claimed this evening to have captured the Palestinian strongholds of Tyre and Nabatea. Earlier, they said they'd taken Beaufort Castle and Hasbaya. There was also a bombing raid on the PLO headquarters in Beirut. Reports say the Israelis are now 17 miles south of the capital, and there's been a sea landing north of Sidon. To emphasize the Israeli successes, Mr. Begin flew today by helicopter to see his troops at Beaufort Castle. Tonight he's back in Israel and has had talks with the American Special Envoy Philip Habib, who had been sent there by President Reagan. Reporting first from Israel, Bill Hamilton.
Tonight, the Israelis are in control of many key positions in South Lebanon. As their artillery pound Palestinian positions on 3 fronts, their air force are continuing to bomb known PLO strongholds. The Israelis say they've achieved all their objectives so far, but the belief is there's more to follow. Sources in Beirut put civilian casualties at over 200. Many have left their homes in the face of advancing troops. In some areas, the army has pushed well beyond the 25-mile line Prime Minister Menachem Begin considered necessary to protect border residents from PLO shelling. Tonight, the cabinet are discussing his talks with America's Middle East envoy, Philip Habib, sent to restore the ceasefire he established last July. Earlier, the Prime Minister visited his force commander at Beaufort Castle, frequently used by the PLO for attacks on border settlements, but now in Israeli hands. Some of the heaviest shelling has been concentrated around the Nabatea Heights. The Palestinians have been endeavoring to counter the air threat with heavy machine gun fire. But they're also facing intense naval bombardment. Tonight, the Israelis completed a huge troop landing north of Sidon, quickly encircled the city, and cut the PLO's road communications to Beirut from the south.
The naval bombardment was accompanied by a reported Israeli landing to the north of Sidon. This afternoon, Israeli bombers flew over Beirut, their target the PLO headquarters.
Meanwhile, their tanks were not far to the south, as our Middle East correspondent Graham Leach reports.
Israeli tanks pressed on relentlessly today, tightening their grip around the main PLO strongholds. Beaufort Castle, Nabatea, Hasbaya were all reported to have fallen. The tanks drove forward, cutting into the PLO's supply routes and blocking their retreats. The Israeli columns advanced in 3 separate axes across the 30-mile-wide southern war front. The UN said more mechanized units entered southern Lebanon today. The PLO said they were putting up stiff resistance to the advancing Israeli columns. In each of their strongholds, the Palestinians hung on until the very end. They claim to have knocked out over 60 Israeli armored vehicles in the fighting so far. Israeli warplanes prepared the ground for the Israeli advance, pounding the port city of Tyre and all along the Mediterranean coastline to within a few miles of Beirut. The PLO's stronghold in Sidon was reported encircled by this evening. The capital Beirut was once again visited by Israeli warplanes. The target was a PLO office located in a heavily built-up Palestinian quarter. The nearby Arab University was also hit. As happened in last Friday's raid, panic broke out among those seeking shelter. So far, there's no confirmed information on the number of casualties. The American embassy in Beirut was the target of a rocket attack during the day. Embassy staff, many of whom are soon due to be evacuated from Beirut because of the situation, dived for cover. No injuries were reported, though emergency services headed for the embassy as a precaution. As the Israeli attacks continued, so more Lebanese targets were hit, causing serious damage to the country's battered economy. As the invasion goes on, the impression is growing here that the Israelis intend to neutralize the PLO's military capability once and for all, a battle plan which could bring Israeli ground troops into the capital itself. Over the past few days, Beirut has received its most intense attacks yet by Israeli planes. The Lebanese fear that more such raids are likely to follow. Tonight, the coastline south of Beirut is being heavily pounded from naval positions offshore, preparing the way, it seems, for an Israeli drive further north.
It's now apparent that this Israeli action is not being confined to setting up a buffer zone in southern Lebanon. The Israelis are going all out to deal the Palestinians the sort of crippling blow they hope will leave them reeling for years to come. And international pressure from the UN and the superpowers is likely to fall on deaf ears. The Israelis are now inside and north of Sidon. They probably are going to attack Damour, the last Palestinian stronghold before Beirut. At this rate of advance, they could very quickly be in contact with the estimated 250,000 Palestinians who live in camps in South Beirut. The Israelis have warned time after time that they wouldn't hesitate to go that far. If they do, the Palestinians will have to stand and fight. They have nowhere else to go. It would be a terrible, bloody battle, even by the standards of war-torn Beirut. It would leave the Israelis even more isolated diplomatically than they are now. Even American patience with Mr. Begin might be stretched to the limit. And it would solve nothing in the long term, only fuel the hatred held by the Palestinians for the Israelis and ensure the Middle East remains the world's #1 trouble spot.
3 Arabs charged with attempting to murder the Israeli ambassador in London, Mr. Shlomo Argov, have appeared in court in London. All 3 were remanded in custody until next Thursday. Mr. Argov, who was shot in the head last Thursday, is still seriously ill. His condition is described as critical but stable. Tonight, the commander of Britain's land forces on the Falklands has appealed to the Argentine leader at Port Stanley. "Lay down your arms," he said, "and let's end the killing." Using a VHF transmitter and a Spanish-speaking Marine captain as interpreter, Major General Jeremy Moore spoke directly to his Argentine counterpart, Brigadier Mario Menendez. He's a hardliner who's already proclaimed his troops will fight to the last man and the last bullet. So far, his reply isn't known. The deaths continue. A British Gazelle helicopter has crashed in East Falkland, killing 2 people from the Royal Corps of Signals and 2 from the Army Air Corps. One task force correspondent reports tonight that 12 Argentine soldiers have died in 2 separate clashes with British forces, and it's been estimated that about 60 Argentines have died in the past 5 days. Now, according to correspondent Michael Nicholson, the British have stepped up their stranglehold on the Falklands capital.
In
In another jump forward, Marine commandos have outflanked the Argentines north of Stanley. Strong British positions have now been established on the mountains, and we can report now that British sea and land forces control and move freely along the northern waters of East Falklands, and large quantities of stores, guns, ammunition, and men have been moved up there. Earlier, there'd been some apprehension that there would be air attacks against them, but thanks largely to the appalling weather, Argentine aircraft have not until this morning been able to come anywhere near us. This morning, in our first clear morning in a week, Argentines attempted an air attack in San Carlos water. But the planes, possibly Canberra high-level bombers, did not get close enough. One of our missiles sent from the ships in San Carlos water made a direct hit on the aircraft, and it exploded high up in view of everybody on the bridge.
Before the beachhead at San Carlos, Royal Marines landed on the tiny Pebble Island to destroy Argentine Pucara planes on the airstrip there. They were supported by the destroyer HMS Glamorgan, which bombarded Argentine positions. We've just received first pictures of that raid, taken by our crew who were on board HMS Glamorgan when shelling began. Watching the pictures in London, our defence correspondent, Christopher Wayne.
At the time it was made, the attack on Pebble Island was described simply as a raid intended to harass the Argentines. In reality, it was much more than that. Pebble Island dominated the entrance to Falklands Sound and threatened the planned amphibious assault on San Carlos water. So, hidden by bad weather, the warship approached. The bombardment by 4.5-inch guns started in pitch darkness and continued for hours. On shore, the SAS were destroying Argentine aircraft and fuel dumps. The bombardment continued until dawn, when helicopters lifted the raiders out. But what about possible danger to civilians on the island?
Can you assure us that the shells that are being fired are pinpointed exactly? People must wonder, novices especially, how accurate the shelling can be with civilians on the islands.
Yes, our gunnery is, we like to think, very accurate, and there is a spotter ashore who adjusts the fall of shot to where he wants it to be.
So you know exactly where it's going?
Yes, I do.
The ship had fired well over 100 salvos. With daylight, the warships headed northeast, out of range of Argentine airstrikes and towards the rest of the task force. Amongst the task force, more than a score of ships were involved in cross-decking, moving tons of supplies and hundreds of men between ships as they prepared for the assault on San Carlos Bay. The most valuable supplies of all were the reinforcements of Sea Harriers and RAF ground attack Harriers, which had arrived on the Atlantic conveyor. They were ferried to the Hermes together with some helicopters. A few days later, the conveyor was hit by an Argentine Exocet missile. She went down with thousands of tons of supplies, but not her jump jets.
Survivors from the merchant ship Atlantic Conveyor arrived back in Britain today, among them the first civilians to be caught up in the fighting. 134 men landed at Brize Norton in Oxfordshire in an RAF VC-10. Apart from the merchant seamen on board, Atlantic Conveyor was carrying men from all the services to help her in her role with the task force. Peter Main was at Brize Norton as the plane taxied in.
Everything had been arranged so that the 134 survivors from Atlantic Conveyor could be reunited with their families in the privacy of the passenger terminal. But most of the wives, girlfriends, children and parents of the servicemen and merchant seamen just couldn't wait that long. There were a great many emotional hugs and kisses out on the tarmac. The last time they'd seen each other was on April the 25th, when the ship slipped out of Devonport for its fateful voyage to the South Atlantic. It was an amazingly joyful occasion, but one that was tinged with sadness. 12 men, merchant seamen and service personnel lost their lives in the missile attack on Atlantic Conveyor. One of them was our master, Captain Ian North.
We know that he got off the ship. We know that he got to a life raft, all right. The last he was seen was groping his way from one end of the life raft to the other. He never made it, I'm afraid, and we have to assume that he drowned.
Later, senior officers gave a press conference.
he and I were on the bridge during the whole of this incident, and that was in fact the nerve centre in terms of damage control. And we had our teams up there reporting to us. And we left the ship together last. He, as the master, went down the ladder 3 paces above me.
The chief officer was asked what he remembered about the attack.
I just remember after the alarms went, I went out onto the port bridge wing, and there were 2 loud explosions followed by a very loud supersonic roar as the sound of the missiles caught up with the actual missile.
What did you do then?
I hit the deck with everybody else.
Well, there was a terrific bang, and all the bits and pieces in my cabin fell down, you know, the light fittings and various things like that.
Did you know as soon as she was hit that she was lost?
No. We tried to fight it afterwards, you know. There wasn't that thought at all.
Would you be prepared to go back now, if you lost?
I don't know. I don't think my wife would like me to, so I've got to take that into consideration anyway.
I've never been so frightened in my life, and yet we've never been so calm. I didn't see anyone panic, including the youngsters, and I had some young lads there with me, and they did a lot of the jobs that they normally would have to be told to do without being told to do it. And we was trying to cool down the fuel on the deck.
What did it look like at the moment after, when it was in its full fury?
Black smoke, and it's choking black smoke. Solid wall of it.
Unlike the Atlantic conveyor survivors, some of the men from the task force who arrived in the Hydra at Montevideo yesterday were seriously wounded. Several had to have medical checks to make sure they were fit to fly home. The less seriously wounded left for the airport in buses, waved off by the Padre and cheered by the Hydra's crew. After a long flight via Ascension Island, the 54 arrived at RAF Bryce Norton this afternoon. They were then ferried to the Joint Services Hospital near Swindon in a fleet of ambulances.
The VC-10 carrying the wounded, which arrived back at Bryce Norton this evening, was delayed for some time in Uruguay. Customs officers discovered that it was carrying spares for Harrier jets. The British Embassy has apologised for the incident and has said the crates should have been taken off at Ascension Island. Also about to leave the Falklands are about 1,000 Argentine prisoners taken during the battle for Goose Green 10 days ago. Reporting from Port San Carlos, Robert Fox.
The 1,000 or so prisoners are being kept in cabins on the ferry Norland, some sleeping on floors in sleeping bags. They get 2 stews a day, though they have had chicken, cheese, salami and milk for one breakfast. They are keen to get home, and the Norland will take 4 days at least to get to Montevideo if the government of Uruguay lets it land the prisoners there. The Air Force commander captured at Goose Green, Wilson Pedroso, has complained about being kept in a combat zone and that the dead from the battle weren't buried for 48 hours. And his men were made to move ammunition. 3 died when some blew up. But it has been pointed out that the dead were so scattered on the battlefield that prisoners were needed to gather them up, and that the prisoners wanted to move the ammunition and petrol from their own accommodation themselves. The Army Colonel, Italo Piaggi, said he was happy at his treatment, but he warned that the Argentinians would fight on, even if Port Stanley fell. We still have all the means to do this, he said.
250 Argentines died on the battlefields at Goose Green and Darwin. They were buried yesterday. Our correspondent Brian Hanrahan was there.
It had begun to rain during the night, and by the time the grey overcast sky showed sufficient light for the service, the trench dug as a mass grave was already beginning to fill with water. There were other similar graves scattered across the battlefield, but only one burial service at the base of the hill where the casualties had been heaviest. It was attended by the 3 senior Argentine officers, their capes hanging damply about them as they stood at attention behind the British brigadier. Bareheaded on the bleak hillside, the Roman Catholic chaplain began the service with the words, "It is our solemn duty to bury the dead." Most of the rest of the words were swept away by the winds, which tugged at the purple stole around his neck and threw cold rainwater into his face. Beside him, an Argentine priest repeated the service in Spanish. He stooped to drop earth into the grave. It splashed into the water at the bottom. Then the chaplains and officers stood at the salute to say the Our Father, the words mingling in English and Spanish. There was no other ceremony. As the small group turned away, a wooden cross was placed to mark the grave on the empty hillside. All the people of this small settlement are likely to let remain after 2 months of Argentine occupation.
In Buenos Aires, the military authorities say there's been little activity on the Falklands. They say they've carried out night bombing raids by Canberra bombers, and they claim to have forced some British Marines to retreat after they clashed with an Argentine patrol near Port Stanley. Earlier, Argentina said its troops had harassed British infantrymen by shelling their positions. The British had returned the fire. An Argentine news agency is claiming that Argentina is having no difficulty in replacing weapons and ammunition. It's named several countries who are willing to supply arms, including Middle Eastern ones. President Ronald Reagan has arrived in Britain on a visit, part of his European tour. From France, where he'd attended the Versailles summit, he flew this morning to Rome. There he met the Pope. This evening, he and Mrs. Reagan arrived at London Airport on their way to Windsor to stay with the Queen. Gary Lloyd reports.
Half an hour late, but no discourtesy intended. The presidential flying machine delivers the most powerful man in the Western world to Heathrow with his wife. A glamorous day this. They'd breakfasted in Versailles after the summit conference, called on the Pope in Rome, and come to London to stay with the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. Few American tourists could have wished for more. America's First Lady, a role she visibly enjoys, was here last year for the royal wedding. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the welcoming party too. Disappointment set aside over the American two-step about the Falklands issue at the United Nations. The Reagans then Windsor-bound, travelling in their own helicopter at the insistence of the presidential security machine. Mr. Reagan's faltering supporters in the States will relish these pictures of the arrival of their president at Windsor, the world's largest inhabited castle. The Duke of Edinburgh, who'd probably have been just as happy to pilot his guests himself in one of the royal helicopters, leads the way to a moment the Reagans had been savouring, the meeting with our sovereign, their hostess. President Reagan's popularity back home has been on the slide, as the polls have been constantly reminding him. He needs this trip and the rest of his European tour to re-varnish his image as a serious statesman rather than a gun-slinging cowboy. So, Queen and President, First Lady and Prince stroll together in the private royal garden. The United States and the United Kingdom boast a special relationship, but there's been less than loving accord in planning this visit. Attempts by the presidential publicity men to cast aside some of the traditional protocol has ruffled official feathers, both American and British, but no sign of it here. Connoisseurs of diplomatic niceties should know it's an official rather than a state visit. Mr. Reagan is only the second American president to stay here as guest of the monarch. The last was Woodrow Wilson in 1919. For President and Mrs. Reagan, a guard of honour of the British Grenadiers and a military display of civilities. After a private dinner tonight with the Queen and the Duke, President Reagan tomorrow will go horse riding with the Queen, while Prince Philip takes Mrs. Reagan for the dignity of a carriage drive.
The President and his vast entourage had begun their day in France and then dropped by in Italy, the President's own words as he hopped by helicopter around Rome. He brought a security headache as the walls of the Vatican echoed to the radio chat of American Secret Servicemen. The Vatican countered with its own more traditional security. A private audience with Pope John Paul awaited the President, nearly an hour alone together. Mrs. Nancy Reagan was not so privileged and had to wait outside with the numerous White House and Vatican officials. Later, there were courtesy calls on the President and the Prime Minister, and not much time for serious discussion. The Middle East crisis hovered over the visit. The Italians expressed concern. The American president was, as they say, kept in touch, as over 100 vehicles whisked the traveling White House around Rome in a few hours of high security and polite formalities.
President Reagan's visit.
This is the News at 1 from ITN with Peter Sissons.
Hello, good afternoon. A President of the United States travels to Westminster and becomes the first holder of that office to address both houses of the Mother of Parliaments. Indeed, President Reagan has just left Westminster and is now in Downing Street, and we can go over to learn more about that from Alistair Burnett.
Peter, the lunch guests are arriving at Downing Street and their cars are being driven away into the Foreign Office. Mrs. Thatcher met President Reagan at the door, and Mrs. Reagan, and of course everyone was there in full force. The President said that he'd had an enjoyable time in the House of Commons, he'd felt the warmth, and now inside, lunch isn't due to start until about 1:20 with all the guests present. And we're hoping to see a picture of Mrs. Thatcher and President Reagan inside number 10 in the drawing room, which is just upstairs. And of course we are, some of us at any rate, are ready and waiting for that. And we think that's going to be the settee on which they may well sit for the team photograph. President Reagan pleased Mrs. Thatcher today when he spoke about the Falkland Islands and about the fight that Britain was making there, and probably cleared away a number of the doubts which had risen in a number of people's minds about whether the United States attitude was a clear one in support of Britain or was not. He also spoke in favor of arms control, arms limitation, especially nuclear arms. There was a brief demonstration at the end of Downing Street as he drove in, I suppose about 20 or 30 people shouting Reagan out, but there seems little doubt that he has got that message, and in his visit to Europe he's going to emphasize that the United States does wish negotiations. Out in Whitehall, the crowds in the sunshine, as the traffic goes past the Cenotaph again. It has been a state visit which has been, well, restricted so that the traffic flows in London as much as it can. It's a good-humoured crowd. It's not a capacity crowd for him, partly because nobody knew which route he was going to take from Buckingham Palace. But he's certainly now safely inside number 10 Downing Street after his speech. Also in his speech were words about supporting parliamentary democracy around the world. Well, we go back to you, Peter, now, but you'll come to us, I hope, when President Reagan reappears.
Thank you, Alistair. You've already stolen the Reagan headlines, but let me remind everyone of them. The President spoke to both houses of Parliament of defending freedom and democracy, and got applause for saying that the British task force in the Falklands were fighting for a cause. To the Soviet Union, he said, "We're not asking for an instant transformation." He said we must take action to assist democracy in right-wing dictatorships and communist regimes alike. The other main news this lunchtime, a helicopter carrying the Queen Mother makes an emergency landing at Windsor. In the Middle East, Israeli forces take the city of Tyre in the Lebanon and shoot down 4 Syrian fighters. And from the Falklands, we have the first film of the British ashore at St. Carlos Bay. But first, President Reagan's speech, which finished just a few minutes ago, to both houses of Parliament. He said each stop of his tour of Europe was important, but his visit to Westminster occupied a special part in his heart, and those of all Americans, because it was a moment of kinship and homecoming in these hallowed halls. Every American would feel at home in your house, he said, because this is one of democracy's shrines. Here the rights of free people and the processes of representation have been debated and refined. It was a wide-ranging speech on world affairs, in the middle of which he spoke about 2 current wars, the Falklands and the Lebanon.
Distant islands in the South Atlantic, young men are fighting for Britain. And yes, voices have been raised protesting their sacrifice for lumps of rock and earth so far away. But those young men aren't fighting for mere real estate. They fight for a cause, for the belief that armed aggression must not be allowed to succeed, and the people must participate in the decisions of government. the decisions of government under the rule of law. If there had been firmer support for that principle some 45 years ago, perhaps our generation wouldn't have suffered the bloodletting of World War II. In the Middle East now the guns sound once more, this time in Lebanon, a country that for too long had to endure the tragedy of civil war, terrorism, and foreign intervention and occupation. The fighting in Lebanon on the part of all parties must stop, and Israel should bring its forces home. But this is not enough. We must all work to stamp out the scourge of terrorism that in the Middle East makes war an ever-present threat.
Let's leave the speech for a moment and go live to Downing Street and Alistair Burnett.
And here is the family picture, Mr. and Mrs. Thatcher and President and Mrs. Reagan. So Dennis Thatcher with his back to us, Mrs. Reagan, in her blue hat as we can see. The President smiled. Mrs. Thatcher puts her bag down on the settee. This is the photograph. This is one of the ones of President Reagan's grand tour. And Mrs. Thatcher obviously very pleased with what he has said today. It's just a moment that they've snatched before they have lunch at 1:20, shaking hands with Secretary of State, Mr. Al Haig, and with his wife, who were in the Royal Gallery at Westminster to hear the speech.
Good morning. General Sir Edwin and Lady Bramall.
Good morning, our Chief of Staff. Good morning.
Mr. Edward Meese.
Welcome, good to see you again.
Well, Mr. Reagan knows Mr. Meese. He's his special counselor, and some people say the Vice President in real fact.
Mr. and Mrs. Hudson.
Welcome, Mrs. Hudson. Welcome, nice to see you. Mr. Hudson made a film.
Well, that's still going on now, live, but we go back to what happened just a few minutes ago at the Palace of Westminster, where the President made history by addressing both houses. The President went on to say that beyond the world's trouble spots lay a deeper, more positive pattern, because, as he put it, the democratic revolution is gathering new strength. He said this was also apparent in the communist world, where, in his words, man's instinctive desire for freedom and self-determination surfaces again and again.
Here in the Western democracies will determine whether this trend continues. No, democracy is not a fragile flower. Still, it needs cultivating. If the rest of this century is to witness the gradual growth of freedom and democratic ideals, we must take actions to assist the campaign for democracy. Some argue that we should encourage democratic change in right-wing dictatorships, but not in communist regimes. Well, to accept this preposterous notion, as some well-meaning people have, is to invite the argument that once countries achieve a nuclear capability, they should be allowed an undisturbed reign of terror over their own citizens. We reject this course. As for the Soviet view, Chairman Brezhnev repeatedly has stressed that the competition of ideas and systems must continue, and that this is entirely consistent with relaxation of tensions and peace. Well, we ask only that these systems begin by living up to their own constitutions, abiding by their own laws, and complying with the international obligations they have undertaken. We ask only for a process, a direction, a basic code of decency, not for an instant transformation. We cannot ignore the fact that even without our encouragement, there has been and will continue to be repeated explosions against repression and dictatorships. The Soviet Union itself is not immune to this reality. Any system is inherently unstable that has no peaceful means to legitimize its leaders. In such cases, the very repressiveness of the state ultimately drives people to resist it, if necessary, by force.
The President of the United States addressing Lords and Commons a short time ago. Earlier this morning, a helicopter carrying the Queen Mother from Windsor had to make an emergency landing on Smith's Lawn in Windsor Great Park, minutes after taking off. It had developed a technical fault. The Queen Mother, it's reported, was unhurt and continued her journey by car. She dined the previous night with the Queen and President Reagan and had been on her way to Kent to carry out engagements at Ramsgate and Margate. These have been cancelled, but the Queen Mother will continue with her afternoon schedule at Canterbury. President Reagan's day began early this morning with a much publicised ride in Windsor Home Park. It's something he does as often as he can at home. The difference this time was that he went riding with the Queen, with whom, of course, he's staying at Windsor Castle. This from Anthony Carthew.
Just an ordinary day's riding at Windsor. The Queen, the President, and 250 cameramen. The President was very keen on this event because of its impact on American breakfast time television, and he would dearly have liked to talk to the cameras. Indeed, he did have a go.
Beautiful.
He added that if the media would kindly stand still, he would jump over them, but the Queen wanted a ride, not a press conference. So the stately progress began. The President's horse held its head low. It's what the Queen calls a sensible horse. She offered gentle advice on holding the reins. Behind came the Duke of Edinburgh, driving Mrs. Reagan in his carriage. And sitting at the back, American security in sunglasses, British security in a bowler. Finally, two Secret Servicemen, both radioed up for the occasion. And so off they all went, Queen, President, Duke, First Lady and security into the summer idyll of the great park. Anthony Carthew, News at 1 at Windsor.
Now news of that other war the President mentioned in his Westminster address. Israel's invasion of Lebanon entered its third day today, with further attacks on Palestine guerrilla bases and Lebanese coastal cities. The Israelis have claimed their tanks are now only a few miles from the Lebanese capital of Beirut, and the cities of Tyre and Sidon have already been captured. Tyre itself was said to be in flames. The Palestinians have put up fierce resistance as the Israeli armoured columns, said to have around 500 tanks and scout cars, have pushed north towards Beirut. From Tel Aviv, Peter Alan Frost reports.
Israeli forces have occupied most of southern Lebanon during the past 3 days, some 290 square miles, and troops still appear to be advancing on Damour, a major PLO stronghold south of Beirut. Israeli casualties so far have been given by the military command here as 25 dead, 7 missing and 96 wounded. In addition, an Israeli pilot was captured in the early stages of the fighting. Israel's aim appears to be not only to drive the Palestinians north, out of artillery range of the northern Israeli settlements, but rather to try and deal the PLO a death blow. Israel's military spokesman said that in a dogfight this morning north of Beirut, 2 Syrian MiG warplanes were shot down, and this might be an indication of Syrian intentions to enter the fight, which so far appears to be primarily limited to the Israelis and the Palestinians. Peter Alan Frost, News at 1, Tel Aviv.
And a short while ago, 2 more Syrian MiG fighters were shot down in dogfights with the Israelis in the north. That brings to 4 the number of Syrian warplanes lost today alone. Here's our defence correspondent, Geoffrey Archer.
During the last Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon in 1978, the Palestinians minimized their losses by falling back steadily before the Israeli advance and drew the Israeli tanks further into Lebanon than they intended to go. But this invasion is on a larger scale, having already captured Beaufort Castle, the Palestinian stronghold they failed to take last time. Whether the Palestinians have been able to save themselves by retreating this time remains to be seen, but they're running out of land in which to hide. Bombed and shelled by the Israelis in the south, they face a buffer of Lebanese Christian forces in the north. It's clearly the Israelis' aim to disable the Palestinian military forces once and for all. The Israeli Premier, Mr. Begin, yesterday met Mr. Philip Habib, the American mediator who arranged a ceasefire after last year's hostilities. And for the moment, Mr. Habib is all that America is prepared to use to try to stop the fighting in Lebanon. With President Reagan and Secretary of State Haig hopping from one European capital to another, it was left last night to the American Vice President, Mr. George Bush, to chair a crisis meeting in Washington on the issue. That meeting decided against using the pressure of economic sanctions against Israel at the moment. Mr. Habib should see what he could do first. The reality is that Israel is unlikely to listen to any appeals to withdraw until she has achieved what she wants, and that is to prevent the Palestinians from being able to attack Israel from Lebanon. The invasion in 1978 left Israel in control of a 6-mile-wide strip of Lebanon along the border with Israel, with United Nations troops providing a further 10 miles or so of buffer. But Palestinian artillery could fire over those zones into Israel. So now Israeli forces have captured Beaufort Castle and Tyre on the coast and are pressing northwards to the Zahrani River, which would give them a 25-mile buffer zone. The coast road is the main supply route for Palestinian forces in the south, and that road, together with Palestinian strongholds inland, are coming under heavy attack. The United Nations mandate in southern Lebanon expires later this month, and since Israel has clearly ignored the wishes of the United Nations, that mandate may well not be renewed. Israel has said her forces will stay in Lebanon until there is a watertight political agreement that prevents further Palestinian attacks on her frontiers with Lebanon. But in all the clamour to stop the fighting, there is no new effort being made to solve the problem at the root of it all, the finding of a homeland for the 300,000 Palestinians who live in Lebanon.
Geoffrey Archer. Now to the Falkland Islands, and better late than never, we've just received the first pictures of the British landings on the East Falklands. The Marines and Paras went into San Carlos Bay in several waves. The first troops into the bridgehead went under cover of darkness. By dawn, they were still going in, ever anxious of the threat of Argentine attacks from the air. The men ashore quickly established what anti-aircraft defences they could to cover the approach of those who followed them. Before those attacks came, almost all the troops made it safely to the beaches with their heavy equipment and armour. Our reporter with the task force, Jeremy Hands, takes it up from there.
The landing took place in total darkness. For 4 hours we were steered through narrow waters with the assault troops, while all the while the Argentine attention was successfully drawn by a series of very heavy naval bombardments. We'd been told to expect an opposed landing. A company of about 100 Argentine soldiers had been seen in this area and were thought to be waiting for us. But in fact, when we waded ashore, there was neither sight nor sound of an enemy. And since then, these troops have been very busy, spreading out and digging in, knowing that the Argentines are probably very close and almost certainly by now know exactly where we are. The biggest fear for us has been from Argentine aircraft. They had until our own anti-aircraft missiles were installed a free run at us if they could find us in time. At first light, our frontline supplies started being flown in. The troops had arrived with no more than they could carry. The Sea Kings and Wessex helicopters lost no time in bringing in a lot more. But the supplying was constantly interrupted by full-scale alerts for Argentine aircraft known to be operating in the area. The aim was simple, to establish a firm foothold back on the Falklands before going into the second phase of any British incursion. On the hillsides around the beachhead, troops fortified and prepared for whatever might lie in store. The countryside, as expected, offered little or no cover. Natural contours of the land and sheep station facilities, if they exist, otherwise it's just a hostile environment in almost every sense of the word. The troops were fighting a battle they hadn't expected would be quite so severe. The locals, though, have seen it all before and are seeing it now with a sense of continuing bewilderment. The Argentines have visited them, either can't read English or decided to let things be. But the Falklanders were quick to lend a hand when the British wanted help with shifting their ammunition and other frontline stores. A younger resident took a more philosophical view of the Argentines. What were they like when they came?
Not too bad.
Not too bad? Where did you get the rifle from?
Dad made
Are you glad that the British Marines are back now?
it. Yep.
But even as the Union Jack was being raised by the Royal Marines, the battle for the Falklands seemed to be only just beginning. Jeremy Hands, British Television News, on the Falklands.
Back home, health service workers
force off East Falkland, and we still don't know how many British servicemen were killed, how many were injured, and how many are still missing. The only indication from Mrs. Thatcher tonight is that the number of British casualties was considerable. The Defence Secretary, John Nott, told Parliament this afternoon that the full story would not be known for some time. To release details, he said, could be of assistance to the enemy and put British lives at greater risk. The Argentine planes broke through the British air defences on Tuesday night and bombed ships unloading men and supplies at Bluff Cove and Fitzroy, just to the south of Port Stanley. The landing ship Sir Tristram had virtually completed unloading and was not severely damaged. But her sister ship, Sir Galahad, had only just begun the landing operation and quite a number of men were still on board. Mr. Nott did say 4 Marines and 2 naval men had been killed when a smaller landing craft was hit and 11 Argentine aircraft were shot down. British plans had not been changed because of the attack, he said. The loss of stores and equipment had already been made good, and British forces would go forward to another victory very soon. In Bonn tonight, Mrs. Thatcher, who's there for a NATO summit meeting, talked about the attack to our diplomatic correspondent Keith Graves. Was it a blow to her?
Every time we get bad news from there, it's a blow. One feels every incident, every person who is wounded, and every death. And it is tragic. But it will not prejudice the operation as a whole. We can replace the stores from other stores already on shore. You can never, of course, quite replace them. Well, you just can't replace the men, and that's the tragedy of it.
Do you have any news yourself of the extent of the deaths and injuries? I appreciate you're not going to tell us, but do you know, or are they still trying to work it out?
No, I have no precise news, and we're very wary now of giving figures when we don't know whether they're accurate or not. When you get an incident like that, the people are taken away, and you know they were taken away with great bravery by some of the helicopters. The main thing is to get them to a place where they can have treatment. And you're so anxious to get everyone away that it takes quite some time to check exactly where they have gone and how many there were. The main point is to get them to treatment. And of course, communications are not easy. And so I don't know any more than you do, but it must have been quite serious.
Does it weaken your resolve, an incident like this, to see this through to the end, even if it does mean more violence and more deaths?
No, it doesn't, because we fight for peace with freedom and justice. And our people down there have had their peace shattered, their freedom taken away, and they have no justice. And it's always expensive in life, as well as in money, and it's the life that's more important than the money, to restore it. Our forefathers did it for us, and we mustn't flinch from doing the same for the next generations. In theory, you know these things are going to happen. You realize that there'll be bad days and very difficult incidents. It doesn't lighten the burden or the blow when it comes, but you know you have to go on to achieve your objective.
It's probably going to be some days before the Ministry of Defence reveals just how many casualties there were. This morning, the Ministry was saying that it couldn't give the figures because it didn't have them. This afternoon, though, Mr. Nott said he couldn't give the figures because, he said, to do so could be of assistance to the enemy. Meanwhile, he said, the next of kin are being informed, and he would give more information as soon as reasonably possible. The Ministry has declined to name the regiment principally involved in order that the area of concern for relatives can be narrowed. All we have are several dispatches from newspaper correspondents with the task force, dispatches which, of course, have been seen by the Ministry of Defence before being released to the media last night, which speak several times of the Welsh Guards. The Ministry is naturally not saying what the implications of the incident are for the main assault on Port Stanley. There may have to be a brief delay while lost equipment is replaced. But in his common statement this afternoon, Mr. Nott said quite clearly, as Mrs. Thatcher did later, that the task force commander's plans have not been prejudiced by these attacks, and the losses of stores and equipment are already being made good from other stocks held ashore. When that assault on Port Stanley does come, one important consideration for the British forces will be the well-being of the local people in the town. The Ministry of Defence estimates that there are about 250 Falklanders left in Stanley, and today there's been a positive sign that they are safe. A telegram has reached the head office of the Falkland Islands Company in Derbyshire from the people of Port Stanley. The message, all well, advise relatives and friends, cheers, and it's signed Friends. Also released today in London has been the first Ministry of Defence film of the fighting the day British forces established the San Carlos beachhead. The scenes were filmed by a military cameraman, and among them are the last moments of the frigate HMS Ardent. This was San Carlos water 3 weeks ago. British forces had just gone ashore. Throughout the day of Friday, May the 21st, helicopters shuttled backwards and forwards, bringing in more men and supplies, while British warships patrolled the waters below them. Later that day, the Argentines realized that the landing had taken place, and the first aerial attacks began. Argentine Skyhawk jets came in time and again to bomb British positions and British ships. The frigate HMS Ardent was hit in one of those raids. Her crew tried for hours to control the damage, but ultimately they had to abandon her. HMS Ardent sank later that night. 22 members of her crew perished, 17 were injured. As Ardent burnt in the skies above her, British Harriers fought numerous dogfights with the Argentine Skyhawks and Mirages. In this incident, an Argentine plane was shot down by a Sidewinder missile fired by a Harrier. Other missiles were fired from British ships. Here, a Seawolf races after an Argentine Mirage and catches it. During the engagements that day, 14 Argentine fighters were shot down by British missiles. According to John Knott, those losses represented more than 1/3 of their combat strength that day, the day when the battle for the Falklands began in earnest.
Nicholas Witchell reporting. In Argentina tonight, the military junta of General Galtieri is painting a confident picture. According to the latest communiques, the British losses are so heavy that the planned assault on the island's capital will have to be put back by about 2 weeks. The claims come on a special day for Galtieri and the 28 million people of Argentina, as our correspondent Brian Walker now reports from Buenos Aires.
Today, commemorated as Malvinas Day, is the anniversary of the arrival of the first Argentine governor of the islands during Argentina's brief occupation of them 150 years ago. After the ceremonial, President Galtieri has summoned the crowds here to the Plaza de Mayo later tonight for the first mass rally in weeks. Galtieri has declared himself confident of eventual Argentine success. The story is of a British landing at Fitzroy thwarted with heavy losses, a major British assault from Mount Kent driven back, and a commando raid from behind Stanley repelled also. The normally impassive military spokesman briefed reporters in unprecedented detail. He claimed a major British effort to take Stanley had been defeated and the British were now in serious difficulties.
La playa donde desembarcaron en Fitzroy.
Due to the enormous casualties suffered by the British troops yesterday, the captain estimates that the British troops are not in a position to launch an all-out attack at this moment.
Up to now, even Argentines will have believed that the struggle for Port Stanley was probably a lost cause. But after Tuesday's fighting, the junta may think that they can force a stalemate, leaving the British at the greater disadvantage. But even if the Argentines are exaggerating British difficulties, there's no doubt that their version of the fighting will serve to raise public morale, already heightened in expectation of the celebration of Catholic Argentine nationhood when the Pope arrives here tomorrow.
The Foreign Office said the Argentine officer, Lieutenant Commander Alfredo Astiz, captured on South Georgia, is to be repatriated as soon as possible. He's been held for a week or so in Chichester. Earlier this week, he refused to answer questions put by a Sussex police officer on behalf of the Swedish and French governments. They'd wanted information about the disappearance in Argentina of 3 of their countrymen when Commander Astiz was employed in security. When a helicopter left the Royal Military Police Barracks at Chichester today, there was speculation that the Argentine may have been starting his journey home. But the Foreign Office wouldn't comment. As a prisoner of war, Commander Astiz doesn't have to talk to anyone. The Brazilians have released the RAF Vulcan bomber, which landed in Rio de Janeiro last week when it was running short of fuel. They rejected Argentina's request that they should detain it. But they've held back the missile it had been carrying, and it's understood Britain promised the bomber wouldn't be used in the fighting again. And now the...
Well, let me assure you, Mrs. Rhodes, boy always gets girl, and the butler is invariably the one who done it. So keep watching. That is, when we return in September. Which brings me, alas, to the last letter of the series, which comes from Stan Mason of Huyton, Liverpool.
See you, Barry. Points of view. Toodaloo. Be back soon.
We will. Thanks to you all for writing and watching. Have a good summer, but be careful. Don't watch too much football. So, from me and all the people who make your letters work on the screen, Cass Allen, Anna Barry, Alec Brigonzi, Michael McLean, from us all, goodbye.
In half an hour, in anticipation of Sunday's kick-off in Spain for the World Cup finals, David Coleman, Jimmy Hill and the BBC's special team of reporters examine the task facing the three home countries. World Cup 82. This is BBC One. And now the 9 o'clock news with Michael Burke.
They waved. They kissed. They talked of heroism.
One sailor was badly burnt and wasn't in a position to save himself, and he was kept afloat above the water by another sailor.
The QE2 is home. So the luxury liner returns from war, carrying hundreds of survivors from 3 British warships sunk in the South Atlantic. Tonight we report on the homecoming and talk to the captains who lost their ships. The other headlines tonight: in Buenos Aires, General Galtieri stands beside the Pope. The Pope says he stands for peace. In the Middle East, Israel and Syria agree to a ceasefire. The PLO hasn't decided. And President Reagan in Berlin to visit the wall at the end of his European tour. Good evening. One banner on the Southampton quayside said it all. "Welcome home, lads," it said. "We're so very proud of you." It's normally the rich and the famous that the QE2 brings into her home port. But for the last month, she's been on national service. When she left on May the 13th, she was carrying 3,000 troops to the war in the South Atlantic. Today, she brought home the survivors of that war, 700 men from HMS Coventry, Ardent and Antelope, sunk in the battle for the Falkland Islands. The great liner was a prime target. Her captain took her on a route well out of range of the Argentine Air Force. She sailed to South Georgia, her radio silent, her radar switched off to avoid detection, except when icebergs presented an even greater threat than an Argentine airstrike. At South Georgia, the troops were offloaded into smaller vessels. The survivors from the warships were picked up, and the QE2 headed home. In a moment, John Humphreys reports on the mood on board as she sailed up Southampton water. But first, Francis Coverdale on the liner's most extraordinary homecoming.
Escorted into the Solent by the Royal Yacht Britannia, the QE2 on her way home from a historic voyage. Ahead was a rapturous welcome for the pride of the Merchant Navy, her crew and 700 passengers. But for the survivors of the stricken ships Coventry, Ardent and Antelope, and for the Queen Mother watching them from Britannia, first there was time to reflect on events in the South Atlantic and the colleagues they had lost when their ships were hit. As the QE2 approached the quayside, the time for reflection seemed to be over, and the feeling was mostly one of relief at being home and delight at seeing loved ones. The boys on board had used their entire supply of felt-tip pens writing out messages. Their families replied with frantic waving, though so far unable to make out who was who. But as the liner was pulled into her usual berth at Southampton, it became possible to identify individuals. People strained to see their loved ones, and the cheers and waving became more personal.
Yes, definitely him.
At midday, an hour after they'd first come into sight, the survivors from the 3 ships finally disembarked. 255 men from HMS Coventry, followed by 177 from HMS Ardent and 197 from HMS Antelope. The families were given the privacy of the customs hall for their reunions, but they soon emerged to more cheering from friends and well-wishers.
Welcome home. Obviously you were injured in the blast on Coventry. How are you now?
I'm fine, thank you very much. Yes, feeling great. Nice to be home.
I should think it is. What was it like for you when you saw him?
Oh, marvellous.
And your little boy?
Yes, I haven't heard him speak since I haven't been home for 3 months, but he said, I love you, Daddy, and don't go away again. Fantastic.
What was the immediate reaction on seeing your family?
Just started crying.
Did you?
Yeah, so it's good too. Thank you.
How's Kate?
It's great.
But how can you tell from little pimples on a day? I couldn't see it.
What about when you greeted him in there?
Oh, it was wonderful. No words can explain it. No words.
Just great.
What are you going to do now?
Go and have a drink.
To the pub. To the pub.
As ever on these occasions, there were genuine kisses and kisses for the photographers to be seen by millions the next day.
What's it like to have him home? Great, absolutely great. It's lovely. And how about for you?
Earlier, a few hours out of Southampton, we'd been joined on QE2 by the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse. He came to pay a personal tribute to the survivors of Coventry, Ardent and Antelope, and all 700 of them gathered to hear him, the last time the crews would be together before they're all split up to serve on new ships. The Admiral found a mixture of emotions, excitement at going home and relief that they survived the attacks.
But there is also overwhelmingly the sense of sadness that they've left their ships 8,000 miles away lying at the bottom of the South Atlantic. And above all, that so many of their friends and comrades are not coming home with them.
I knew we'd taken a great deal of punishment. We'd earlier on had 3 bombs hit us, 2 of which caused immense damage, and my men had got that under control, and I thought maybe the worst of the day was over. We were then hit by about 10 bombs in fairly quick succession, which caused absolutely appalling damage and casualties down aft. I still had hoped, of course, that we could save the ship. It became very obvious as I got further reports that I couldn't save the ship, and there comes a time where one has to make the decision if the ship is going to be lost. It is actually more important to save your people, because in fact, in the final analysis, any ship is the ship's company. I would love to serve with them again, and I know every captain always says his men are the best. I certainly believe mine were. I'm just devastated that I can't be with them anymore. Sorry, I can't.
The port side of my ship was blown away. And within a few minutes, the ship took a heavy list to port. There was thick smoke inside, which shocked and disorientated a lot of people. But most people who hadn't been killed instantly got out very fast. I was one of the last ones to get out, and by the time I got up to the bridge, the ship was over at about a 60-degree angle and was clearly going over completely. And it was quite remarkable, the discipline and order of the ship's company. All the life rafts went in the water, and people got into their life rafts in a most brave manner. A lot of lives were saved, because a lot of people got into trouble swimming. Some didn't have life jackets, regrettably. Some got cramped, some couldn't swim. But everybody in the end got into their life rafts. I was one of the last to leave, and I literally walked down the ship's side and jumped in and swam to my life raft.
What about the injuries? You yourself clearly were quite badly burned. Were you not wearing a flash mask, or?
Yes, I was wearing a flash mask, but I'm similar to many others in the operations room, which was close to where the bomb went off. And there was a tremendous flash of light. And my anti-flash was blown off, and so were many of my clothes. And even my hands were burnt, although I had gloves. And so it is difficult to protect that vital bit of the face, because I have to speak on a microphone, and I have to see.
I asked the Admiral if he thought the ships still in the war zone are adequately protected.
You've got to be careful about the adequately protected if you're leaving me into a situation where I'm going to suggest that we shan't lose any more ships. Because, of course, I can't guarantee that. There can never be that situation in war.
Does that worry you?
Oh, of course it worries me. Who wouldn't be worried in this situation? One must be worried. It's only when you're worried that you do your best.
No one denies these men have done their best, but the Admiral told them there's a lot more still to do.
John Humphreys reporting from the QE2. There's still no news tonight of how many people were killed or wounded in Tuesday's attack on two task force landing ships, Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram. They were bombed by Argentine planes and abandoned while helping the army establish a new base at Fitzroy, south of the island's capital, Stanley. At the Ministry of Defence is our reporter, Nicholas Witchell.
Military chiefs have again told Defence Secretary John Nott that at this stage of the Falklands campaign, it would not be in the national interest to give Tuesday's casualty figures. And despite the rumours that that is likely to provoke, the Ministry is sticking to that decision. Their justification is that any step which further confuses the Argentines about the task force's battle readiness in this prelude to the assault on Port Stanley is a necessary step to take. The Ministry is aware that it's likely to bring considerable public criticism and anxiety, but nonetheless it's refusing to give any guidance over the casualty figures. However, we're told that all the next of kin of those involved should have been told either by tonight or by tomorrow morning. All the Ministry will say is that the build-up around Port Stanley continues, with further bombardments of Argentine positions and what it calls aggressive patrolling. In one such patrol on Wednesday, 5 Argentine soldiers were killed. There has been some strafing of British forward positions by Argentine Pucara aircraft, but, according to the Ministry, there were no British casualties.
Nick Witchell. According to reports today, a desperate General Menendez, the Argentine commander on the Falklands, has told the junta in Buenos Aires morale at Stanley is low and things can't go on like this. His conversation was monitored in Chile and passed on to our correspondent Brian Barron, who's at Punta Arenas in the south of the country.
The bleakly pessimistic personal views of General Menendez, the Argentine commander at Port Stanley, have been overheard here on an unscrambled phone link, apparently between his headquarters at Government House and the High Command in Buenos Aires. The message, monitored within the past 24 hours, acknowledges that morale is rather low. General Menendez blames this on the British blockade, the fact that no supplies and no mail for his men have reached Port Stanley recently. Overheard on the radio link, General Menendez said that many of his troops had been promised they were going to be relieved and sent home, but this hadn't proved possible because of the advancing British forces. And General Menendez revealed just how poorly he rates his army's chances by saying, if things go on like this, our situation could crumble rapidly. These unguarded remarks, monitored by specialist sources here, and made by General Menendez with apparent disregard for normal communication security, offer a glimpse of mounting tension within the Argentine occupation force and supply problems which have been sharpened by sustained British shelling and bombing. Of course, many of the 7,000 Argentine troops believed to be around Port Stanley have been on the Falklands from the outset of the crisis 10 weeks ago. But as General Menendez's message indicates, these troops, many of them young conscripts stuck in an offshore war, are showing the strain as the climax approaches.
The Pope.
In a few moments, the news and sport, and then at 9:35, heavyweight boxing, the championship of the world with Larry Holmes versus Jerry Clooney in Las Vegas. More from the rich and powerful world of the Carrington family and dynasty at 10:30, followed at 11:20 by Night Music with Elaine Page and David Essex. At 11:55, Phil Silvers rounds off BBC One's programmes tonight. On BBC Two shortly, Vive la France, and tonight the first showing on British television of Le Mans de Poche, a sensitive story about a schoolboy who falls in love with a call girl. This is BBC One, the time now 9:15, time for the news with John Humphreys.
The battle for Port Stanley has begun. Defence Secretary John Nott talks of a brilliant operation. Israel shrouds her guns and calls a ceasefire with the PLO in Lebanon. The biggest political demonstration in American history. Hundreds of thousands say no to war. And the new member of the House of Lords celebrates his peerage, shopping in the supermarket. Good evening. British forces have made a surprise night attack on the Argentine garrison surrounding Port Stanley. A brilliant attack, according to Defence Secretary John Nott. It was entirely successful, he says. All objectives were achieved and British casualties were light. It's also reported that some of the Argentines fought well, but they've suffered much heavier casualties. More than 300 prisoners were taken. The British have been overlooking Port Stanley for nearly 2 weeks. Last night's attack brings them now to within 5 miles of the town centre, and the Argentines seem to have nowhere left to go. Here's how Defence Secretary John Nott described the attack.
Shortly after dark last night, our forces surrounding Port Stanley carried out what the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Fieldhouse, has described as a brilliant surprise night attack on Argentine positions to the west of Port Stanley. By first light this morning, advances of up to 5 miles had been made and all objectives were taken. The enemy, who were largely asleep at the time, first knew of the attack when our infantry appeared amongst them. Thereafter, there was hard fighting before their positions were taken. Indications so far are that casualties on our side are light. We do not expect any further news tonight.
Today is the first full day of a battle which could last anything up to 4 or 5 days, depending on how long it takes for Argentine fighting spirit to collapse. But it was also the most important day because that 5-mile surge forward means British forces now command the Two Sisters Ridge, the most vital single piece of high ground. From the Two Sisters, the 2 British brigades can now overlook the whole of Stanley. No Argentine troops can move without being spotted, and nowhere is now safe from shellfire, not even the airport. The only inhibiting factor is the weather. It was bad this morning, but reported to be clearing slightly. Bad news from the British viewpoint. What's needed is a low cloud base to make it hard for Argentine aircraft to identify their targets. If it did clear sufficiently for the Argentine Air Force to launch an airstrike, it will certainly have been demanded by General Menendez. If ever since British troops first landed in San Carlos Bay 3 weeks ago, Port Stanley has been the main objective. Last week's secondary landing at Fitzroy was an attempt to speed up the encirclement of the town. It's surrounded by high ground and dominated by Mount Kent 12 miles distant. But Two Sisters Ridge was the key to the Argentine defences. There have been several patrol clashes recently, including one at night between commandos of the Royal Marine SBS and Argentine Special Forces. About 7,000 Argentines are dug in around Port Stanley, but about 2,000 are believed to be support troops, airmen and sailors. The soldiers, overrun last night, were caught asleep but then fought back fiercely. It's not known whether they were elite or conscripts. Last night's attack started with naval bombardment, designed to keep Argentine heads down and to divert their attention. That shelling will continue tonight. But they'll be trying to avoid the 250 civilians who are thought to be sheltering in 2 or 3 stone-built houses in the center of Stanley. By tomorrow, they're likely to be in the front line. The risk to the civilians must be one of the factors worrying General Moore, the commander of British land forces. There's no doubt he'd prefer it if General Menendez would allow the women and children to come out of Stanley under a white flag. But that's not likely to happen. For the moment, at least, it seems the Argentines are now going to dispute every foot of ground over those final 5 miles.
The military command in Buenos Aires reported the British attack on their forces at Port Stanley.
Friends, the first rule of Italian driving. What's behind me is not important.
At 9:15, the good old days, and among the profusion of prolific players to pleasure the platform, the effervescent Bernie Clifton. At 10:05, those memorable moments of the day's birdwatch from the North Sea cliffs at Foulshew in Scotland. programmes to highlight this Sunday evening on BBC One. In a quarter of an hour, there's Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Now on BBC One at 6 o'clock, the news with Jan Leeming.
British troops dig in on the outskirts of Port Stanley, but they're in no hurry to launch the final attack. The Defence Ministry say there's some evidence that civilians have died in the fighting. More British wounded on their way home from the Falklands. They're in good spirit. King Khalid of Saudi Arabia dies. His brother takes over with no policy changes expected. The ceasefire in Lebanon collapses after less than a day. Israelis bomb Palestinian targets in Beirut. As British troops consolidate their positions around Port Stanley after Friday night's surprise attack, the Ministry of Defence tonight conceded that Argentine reports of civilians being killed and injured in the assault could be correct. And Britain has agreed to an international Red Cross proposal that a safe area for civilians should be set up in Port Stanley, now surrounded by British troops. The Ministry of Defence, in a statement this afternoon, said they couldn't be certain about the Argentine reports that 2 women civilians were killed and 4 people injured in the British attack. But, sadly, there's some evidence they are true. And the Ministry also revealed that about 600 Falkland Islanders are thought to be still in Port Stanley, not the 250 or so that was estimated earlier. So Britain wants the Red Cross safe area for civilians implemented right away. It's not known yet what response the Argentines have made.
It's clear that the British government has been having talks with the International Committee of the Red Cross for some days to try to find ways of protecting the civilian population in Port Stanley. And it's understood that a team from the Red Cross has now visited the town. Up to now, British forces have been working on intelligence reports that there were only 250 Falklanders left in the town. They now, though, have new information, probably from the Red Cross, which suggests that there may be as many as 600 civilians still there. That there are so many, and with 2 of them now probably killed in the British bombardment, is obviously adding considerably to the urgency of the Red Cross scheme to devise a neutral area for civilians. The Argentines are understood to be considering that plan, but officials here at the Ministry of Defence say there can be no question of the attack on Port Stanley being delayed while the problem of the civilian population's safety is sorted out. There's no news so far today of that attack being continued. Neither is there any more information about the level of British troop casualties in Friday night's operation, casualties which John Knott said yesterday were light. This morning, the Prime Minister wouldn't comment when she went to morning service at Chequers, though she seemed cheerful. Mrs. Thatcher is expected to return to Downing Street shortly.
In Argentina, the military junta have admitted that a well-equipped British force has penetrated the outer defences of Port Stanley, and that some ground has been lost. Military sources said tonight that fighting was still going on with heavy artillery and mortar exchanges. From Buenos Aires, Clive Ferguson reports.
The latest British offensive was described by a government spokesman as an important attack, but nothing more. Through an interpreter, he refused to concede that the battle for Port Stanley had begun.
This is just another attack against Puerto Argentino. He doesn't have the elements to analyze the exact size of this attack.
Nonetheless, it is being officially admitted that the British forces are throwing everything they have into the battle, and the people, it seems, are being subtly prepared for bad news, because while it's claimed that Argentine troops are adequately equipped and in good spirits, it's being said that the British are using high-technology weapons, the implication being that that sophistication could give them the edge. Officially admitted or not, people here are well aware that the fighting around Port Stanley does amount to the battle that they've been told to expect for the last fortnight. So in the end, the only thing that surprised them was the timing of the offensive, because there was a genuine sense of shock here that the push towards Port Stanley began right in the middle of Pope John Paul's visit to Argentina.
And following on, Clive Ferguson has just told us that Argentina has now lodged an official complaint to Britain over the incidents in which 2 civilians are believed to have been killed and 4 injured during the attack on Port Stanley. Argentina is also protesting against an alleged attack by British aircraft on the Argentine hospital ship Bahia Paraiso, moored at Port Stanley. In London, it's been denied that there have been any attacks on hospital ships. The Foreign Office confirmed that they've received the Argentine protest. It's not clear if they've yet replied. 2 ships have arrived in Montevideo with men on their way home from the fighting. 60 British wounded have been disembarked from the hospital ship Herald. Before that, as John Simpson reports, more than 1,000 Argentine prisoners finished the first leg of their journey in the converted ferry Norland.
The ferry, which in normal times plies between Hull and the continent, was on the last stage of her curious voyage as a floating prisoner of war camp. But it took time. The Argentines wanted no publicity for the arrival here of the prison ship. And it was nearly dark when the Norland passed the converted ferry which was to take the prisoners home. Aboard, the Argentines were put to work cleaning up the ship. The great majority of them were in their teens. One was only 15. Several had been frostbitten before their capture, but the Red Cross found no great complaints about conditions on board. By morning, the Norland was on her way back to the islands. The Hull ferry has never carried a stranger set of passengers, and there'll be more to come. On her way out, she passed the hospital ship Herald, with 60 British wounded aboard, the latest arrival in what the Navy now calls the Montevideo run. Unlike the Norland's arrival, everything was out in the open. There are no great restrictions today about filming the Herald. There is, after all, nothing wrong from the British point of view about allowing people at home to see pictures of the wounded men being brought off. But Uruguayan caution still persists. The government here has ruled that there can be no interviews with anyone from the Herald, even though they can be filmed. The usual cheerfulness prevailed, though some of the men carried painful evidence of their wounds. And yet again, the cumbersome process of shuffling wounded men halfway across the world was working with remarkable smoothness.
The Pope has been
close, but he got it right.
Attack on HMS Glamorgan, and the death toll at Bluff Cove was 50. Defense Secretary says the outcome is not in doubt. We have an eyewitness account of the big push towards Port Stanley. The Israeli PLO ceasefire in the Lebanon has broken down. King Khaled is dead. The world's richest oil state buries its ruler. And Spaniards jeer Britain and cheer Argentina in the opening ceremony for the World Cup. Good evening. The Defence Secretary, Mr. Knott, has said 9 British sailors were killed and 17 injured in an Argentine attack on the destroyer HMS Glamorgan. He also announced that 50 men died when Argentine planes bombed the landing ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram last Tuesday. All relatives have been informed. Mr. Knott said the casualty figures had been kept secret to confuse the Argentines about the strength of the task force. In a separate statement, the Ministry of Defence admitted some Falkland Islanders may have been killed and injured in the latest fighting. Mr. Knott began by giving details of yesterday's attack on Argentine positions west of Port Stanley.
We now firmly hold Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, and Mount Harriet, all of which dominate the ground to the west of Stanley. Some 400 prisoners were captured, together with considerable quantities of equipment, including mortars and anti-tank weapons. It was important for the success of the land operation that the Argentinians were not able to assess exactly when, how, or in what strength we would attack. It is clear that the Argentinians greatly overestimated the extent of the casualties and damage resulting from their air attack on Sir Tristram and Sir Galahad on Tuesday. We wished them to remain uncertain about our strength on the ground and our capability to mount an early attack. None of this, of course, delayed the notification of next of kin, all of whom have been informed. Surprise was achieved in our operations, and the progress made by British forces in their advance towards Port Stanley means that I can now give the official details of casualties from last Tuesday's attack. The landing ships were carrying large numbers of troops from the Welsh Guards and supporting units. 43 men died in the attack or are missing, presumed dead. 46 men were wounded, and a number sustained minor injuries. There were also casualties among the crews of the landing ships. On Sir Galahad, 3 officers and 2 members of the crew were killed, and 2 officers and 9 crew were injured. On the landing ship Sir Tristram, 2 members of the crew were killed. All the remainder of the crew are safe. The wounded are receiving treatment on board British hospital ships. The land operations were supported by Harrier attacks and naval gunfire from ships of the task force. There was also a successful Vulcan attack on Port Stanley Airport. These attacks made a major contribution to the success of our troops. However, in the course of the bombardment, the destroyer HMS Glamorgan was hit by enemy fire, and 9 members of the ship's company were killed and 17 injured. Next of kin have been informed. HMS Glamorgan sustained some damage, but she remains operational and is continuing her activities in the task force. In further operations today, an Argentine patrol craft was detected, attacked, and disabled by Sea Harriers from HMS Invincible. Our successes on the ground over the weekend mark another significant step to securing the complete and final withdrawal of Argentine forces from the Falkland Islands. There is some way still to go, but the outcome is not in doubt.
Military sources in Buenos Aires say there's been more heavy fighting today in the Port Stanley area. The military high command say Argentine jets attacked the new British positions captured yesterday, concentrating on Two Sisters Hill. The high command has conceded its troops were driven back 2 miles by the attack. This report on the fighting from Jeremy Hands, which arrived yesterday, has just been cleared by the Ministry of Defence.
It was a classic commando assault. At midnight, the so-called starting line was crossed simultaneously in 3 places as the British troops attacked the 3 key positions held by the enemy around Port Stanley. All night I monitored the battle with senior officers in a forward commando headquarters. The reports coming in from the units were crisp, clear, and very encouraging. Each British attack was opposed by well-dug-in and well-supplied Argentine troops. We could see and hear the continual barrage of shells, some aimed with deadly accuracy at the enemy strongholds, some, thankfully, less accurate coming towards us. The infantry battle raged throughout the night. In some cases, the British advances were held up by mortar fire, in others by machine guns and snipers, but the forward momentum was never lost. One Argentine heavy machine gun on the Two Sisters was captured with ammunition, and along with much more of their equipment, will now be used against them. A battalion drew special praise from the commanders for their efforts in capturing the heavily defended Mount Longdon. But afterwards, General Jeremy Moore was delighted with everyone's performance. We now have our lead positions exactly where the Argentine lead positions were until last night, he said, adding, there was some extremely good fighting by our young men with excellent support from the Royal Naval Bombardment and our artillery ashore. Before daylight, each of the 3 objectives was secured. British casualties had been remarkably light, but as yet it's been impossible to assess the Argentine losses, although initial reports are that they were heavy. There was no doubt, however, about the number of prisoners taken. By mid-afternoon, 340 Argentines had turned up, some of them considered to be most important. Others had surrendered from positions that weren't even being attacked. I saw some prisoners being brought in, blindfolded, arms tied behind their backs and dejected. And as I moved forward in the fresh, frosty sun of a midwinter morning, the extent of the British success and its importance became even clearer. Our troops, already in control of the important high ground around Port Stanley, now have secured positions from where they can control virtually all comings and goings from the island's capital. The 3 objectives were hard to take indeed, but the rewards are great. Stanley can no longer be regarded as a stronghold for the Argentines, merely a last refuge, which now lies at the mercy of the British guns and encircled by British troops. And as the grip on Stanley tightens, the more Argentine prisoners are seen woefully trudging back to the prisoner of war ships, the mood gets ever more buoyant. They've now not only seen action, but tasted victory in battle too. And while they know firsthand that the Argentine foe is not the pushover he'd been made out to be in some quarters, the British go into the next phase of the operation knowing that he can be beaten. The large white vapor trail, V for victory sign in the sky, provided by 2 Harriers before last night's battle, was an extra encouragement that looks like being quite unnecessary. Jeremy Hands, British Television News, with the Royal Marines near Port Stanley.
The Ministry of Defence have admitted Falkland Islanders may have been killed and injured in the latest fighting outside Port Stanley. They say there is evidence to support Argentine claims that 2 women were killed and 4 other islanders injured, 2 of them seriously. The Argentines have named the dead women as Mrs. Susan Whitley and Mrs. Doreen Bonner. Both lived on the west side of Port Stanley, beyond Government House. The Argentines claim they were killed by British naval bombardment. John Doyle asked a Falklands councillor, Mr. John Cheek, whether he believed the Argentine claim.
We're treating it as probably being true until it's definitely confirmed, but yes, we believe it is probably true.
Now, you've heard of this source from other than from the government sources, haven't you?
Other than the Argentine sources, yes. We got from an amateur radio operator in the Falklands, more or less confirmed the details.
Have you been able to discover exactly what happened?
The Argentinians are saying that it was British naval gunfire. I have my doubts because the houses are, although in the same area, we're talking about 50, 60, 70 yards different. We know there was an Argentine ammunition dump in that area, very close to these houses. My own guess is it went off. How it went off, we don't know.
Now, you know these islanders very well.
One knows practically everyone in Stanley reasonably well. Of those that killed, both of them married, one reasonably young. Husband, in fact, was the veterinary officer, and the other one, the husband worked for the Public Works Department as a surveyor.
The International Red Cross, who visited Port Stanley recently, say there are still 600 islanders in the town. They've suggested a neutral area should be set aside where the civilians could stay safely in concrete houses. Britain has accepted the idea. Argentina is still considering it. Sue Lloyd-Roberts spoke to Mr. Frederick Stienemann of the International Red Cross in Geneva.
We would like there to put all the, to give refuge to all the wounded and sick civilians or military persons, and also to civilian persons who are not taking part in the hostilities.
Now, what is preventing you from setting up one of these neutralized zones?
Now, to set up neutralized zones, the governments have to be agreeing, both governments. So we have now got a positive answer from the British government. We do expect the answer from the Argentinian government, hopefully very soon.
Do you get the impression the Argentinian government will agree to a neutralized zone?
Let's say we hope very much that it will work very soon. Then the civilians certainly need protection there. And maybe it's also to mention that the Geneva Conventions are conventions done by the government itself, and in the convention it's clearly written that the governments have to do everything to protect the civilian population.
So according to the Geneva Convention, Argentina is legally bound to agree to such a zone?
It is bound to protect the civilians, yeah.
The latest British casualties from the Falklands have arrived in Montevideo on their way home to Britain. A hospital ship brought in 60 men, many badly injured. Earlier in Montevideo, 1,000 Argentine prisoners captured at Goose Green were handed over.
At daybreak, another British hospital vessel entered harbour. HMS Herald brought 60 British casualties. They were from the battles in San Carlos Water and Port Darwin. With each wave of men to disembark from the Red Cross-protected ships that have come here, it's evident that the wounded want to put on as brave a face they can in the circumstances. But never before has it been seen with such determination. Some who were in obvious pain hobbled onto the quayside, but still managed to wave and smile to the crew. Others were carried off as best they could and handed to Uruguayan medical teams who ferried them to the airport for the flight home. And with mounting casualties from the fighting, 2 more hospital ships will arrive here next week. 1,000 prisoners came in at dusk aboard the North Sea ferry Norland. They were offloaded during the night at the insistence of the Argentines, no doubt anxious that the world should not see the face of defeat in her men as they filed off the ship in pairs. British officials said the dejected troops were mostly teenagers, the majority barely 16 years old. Brent Sadler, ITN, Montevideo.
Both countries agreed to a Red Cross safety zone there for civilians and wounded. Lebanon, the Israelis trapped 5,000 Palestinians as they cut off Beirut. Good evening. British forces have broken through to within 2.5 miles of Port Stanley. Attacking on 3 fronts, they've secured vital positions in the foothills overlooking the Falklands capital: Tumbledown Mountain, Wireless Ridge, and Mount William. Argentine forces are now said to be in full retreat after fierce fighting overnight. The Defence Secretary, Mr. John Nott, gave the news a short time ago.
We have just received the following information from the Commander British Land Forces, Falkland Islands. Last night, British forces pressed forward from their positions on high ground surrounding Port Stanley. By this morning, our forces had secured the key positions of Tumbledown Mountain and Mount William to the southwest and Wireless Ridge to the northwest of Port Stanley. From their new positions, our forces can see large numbers of Argentine soldiers retreating and streaming back into Port Stanley. Our forces are moving forward to exploit their success.
Radio messages from Port Stanley to the Argentine mainland have revealed that conditions behind the Argentine lines are deteriorating and that Argentine troops are suffering greatly. But the radio broadcasts have now broken down after what seems to be a total loss of power.
ITN has been monitoring the 2 open shortwave radio links from Port Stanley to the Argentine mainland. Over the weekend, as usual, sons, husbands and fathers serving with the Argentine forces in Stanley, talking to their families in Buenos Aires. A sad insight into the human tragedy of the war and the revelation that the troops suffered greatly on Friday night in particular. Yesterday, the open lines completely broke down. Before they did so, an Argentine commander spoke openly of their desperate need for an item codenamed 1701 and warned that conditions were now so bad that it could not now be delivered. His last words were, "My power is failing." Since then, the line has been dead. Today, only the teletyped, coded transmissions are getting through from the Argentine army, 5-letter combinations which are unscrambled by computer and which can be transmitted on battery-run portable radios. With an apparent total loss of mains and generated power, verbal contact between Argentina and the Falklands appears to have been out for more than 24 hours. John Snow, ITN, Punta Arenas.
At Mount Harriet, British troops have found thousands of rounds of deadly dum-dum bullets in captured Argentine ammunition boxes. The hollow-nosed bullets, which spread on impact, are banned under the Geneva Convention. A safe zone has been set up by the Red Cross in Port Stanley, where civilians can shelter during the final battle for the town. As many as 600 people are still thought to be trapped there between the Argentine forces and advancing British troops. The quarter-mile square zone around the town's stone cathedral would provide the shelter.
The Red Cross neutralized zone lies on the waterfront at Port Stanley, in the middle. The main Argentine gun emplacements are to either side of the built-up area. It's about 100 meters by 120 and makes up about 1/20th of the whole town area. As Red Cross officials said today, it will be adequate but cramped. The block will be marked out by Red Cross flags and more will be painted on rooftops. There are about 20 houses in all, and all of them, except 2 or 3, are wooden. But the area does include, and we assume this is why it's been chosen, the island's largest stone building, the cathedral. We can see it here in the background of film shot after the invasion. Built of brick, it'll keep the islanders safe, though they're unlikely to be comfortable. There are no cooking facilities and only 1 toilet. It's problems like these that the 5 Red Cross officials will be sorting out as they move on to the island today. But their priorities are setting up medical facilities and marking out the area clearly, identifying it to the local population and combat forces and making it quite clear who can go in, civilians and wounded only. There'll be the problem of identifying it by night. It's assumed a system of floodlights will have to be installed. Another problem, some islanders might not want to move into the zone. I put this to the Red Cross official who's monitoring the operations from Geneva.
There's no pressure on anybody to go in. This is a zone. Red Cross is never pressurizing people who don't want to do things. So everybody who is in the category is free to go in. Others who want to take other responsibilities, they are free also not.
Who Who will administer the zone?
Normally, zones are administered by the government concerned, and ICRC is present to help to build it out.
Which government would this be?
Yeah, at this stage, it's the Argentinian government.
One of the British successes in the battle for the Falklands has been the Harrier jump jet. They've shot down large numbers of Argentine planes. Ray Maloney asked a Harrier pilot, who was just back from the Falklands, whether the dogfights compared with those in the Second World War.
The majority, no. The majority have been close engagements of the Harrier being directed onto an escaping, or indeed an attack coming into the AOA, with no hard turning fight, just a quick acquisition with the missiles, let the missiles go, they destroy the aircraft, and then we clear.
A lot of people back here are amazed, even frightened by the lethal nature of the weapons that are being used in war, particularly in the war in the Falklands. What do you feel about them?
Well, I think that there are a number of missiles that are coming out head and shoulders above the overall level of fighting. The Sidewinder missile we're using, the Seawolf missile that the Navy is employing on the Type 22, and indeed the Sea Dart battery, and also from the Argentinians' side, the Exocet missile, are proving very, very lethal indeed.
And now the Lebanon. The Israelis say they've completely cut off the Lebanese capital, Beirut, trapping 5,000 Palestinians. They also say they're in full control of Beirut airport. The Israelis have been linking up with the Lebanese Christian militiamen from the north of the country, and between them they have the Palestinian positions in Beirut completely surrounded.
The Israelis arrived overnight, and by morning had positioned themselves on hilly slopes overlooking Beirut.
Followed by the hit of the explosion, and then, a few seconds later, the Catherine wheel-like buzz of twisted red-hot metal fragments, sounding a second alarm, all sounds and images we shall never forget. One lump fell by my feet. I picked it up. Red-hot, I dropped it again quickly. When it was cool, I picked it up and examined its jagged edges. Some of the men around me weren't so lucky. They bear the injuries such devices are meant to inflict. But amongst our three-company attack, more than 300 men in all, only one man died, a corporal. How the others escaped, I don't know. I have to put it down to the skill, determination, and courage of the men themselves. Edging nearer, the lead units fired off their anti-tank weapons, Milan 66 and 84mm rockets, streaks of white light flashing upwards to explode among the rocks and stones. But as one gun was silenced and we moved out from behind our cover, others would open up. The progress was, as I've said, painfully slow, but it was over as quickly as it had begun. Gaining the high ground to their flank, the troops were in a position to infiltrate the enemy positions in strength. Before long, prisoners were taken and the firing died down. The experience of the previous 3 hours had been so intense it had left some of us drained and inarticulate. As one officer told me later, "What do you say when someone asks you weeks afterwards how you felt? You can't answer them. For a long time afterwards, your feelings just don't seem to exist."
Defense. Talks on...
Mrs. Thatcher says there are white flags all over Port Stanley. Menendez flies to Buenos Aires after meeting General Moore. The burial of Colonel H. at Goose Green. The Israelis say they cut off 5,000 Palestinians in Beirut. Good evening. The Prime Minister has just said in the House of Commons that the Argentines are flying white flags over Port Stanley. She said British troops had entered the town and large numbers of Argentine troops had thrown down their weapons. Negotiations for a surrender are now going on, she said. Earlier, the Argentine Military High Command had said a ceasefire had been agreed on the Falklands to last until 2 p.m. our time tomorrow. There'd been no confirmation before that from the Ministry of Defence in London. Whitehall sources were saying that 7,000 Argentine troops in Port Stanley were on the run, fleeing through the deserted streets. Meanwhile, the Pentagon in the United States was saying that the Argentines were in the process of surrendering. Mrs. Thatcher had left Downing Street for the Commons a short time ago,
and she's making her statement in the House now. The ceasefire was reportedly arranged at a face-to-face meeting between General Mario Menendez, the Argentine commander on the Falklands, and Major General Jeremy Moore, commander of the British Land Forces. General Menendez was then reported to have flown to Buenos Aires to report to the military junta there. Although it hasn't confirmed the ceasefire, the Ministry of Defence said task force commanders had the authority to accept a surrender. Now we have Mrs. Thatcher's statement in the House.
After successful attacks last night, General Moore decided to press forward. The Argentinians retreated. Our forces reached the outskirts of Port Stanley. Large numbers of Argentine soldiers threw down their weapons. They are reported to be flying white flags over Port Stanley. Our troops have been ordered not to fire except in self-defense. Talks are now in progress between General Menendez and our Deputy Commander, Brigadier Waters, about the surrender of the Argentine forces on East and West Falklands.
The first sign of an impending Argentine collapse came with a brief statement from the Defence Secretary, Mr. Nott, this afternoon. He said a second major British assault overnight had pushed the Argentine soldiers from their last full defensive line, and that they were running back to Stanley. Last night, the British commanded the Two Sisters Ridge, some 7 miles west of Stanley. The Argentines were still on Tumbledown Mount and Wireless Ridge, but then last night came the final big push. Thousands of Royal Marines, paras and guardsmen battled fiercely with the Argentines and captured their hilltop positions. But the British commander saw hundreds of Argentines running back to Stanley, and he decided to follow through his attack. The Argentine soldiers were chased all the way to the town, and fierce fighting was reported on the outskirts, well away from the safe area for civilians allocated by the Red Cross earlier in the day. During the first British push towards Stanley last Friday, over 50 Argentine soldiers were killed, but there were British losses too. Over 20 British soldiers were believed killed in that action. British deaths in the Falklands crisis amount to more than 220, therefore, and the Argentines are thought to have lost over 750 men. In spite of clear skies today and yesterday, the Argentine Air Force has not been able to mount major raids against British troops, though in a brief attack yesterday, another Mirage was shot down. The ceasefire is due to run until 2 p.m. London time tomorrow. The Argentine commander will presumably be using that time to try to negotiate the most honourable surrender that he can. But Britain will be insisting on nothing less than the total withdrawal of all Argentine troops from the islands. And that will have to include the 1,000 or so Argentine soldiers still left on West Falkland at Fox Bay and Pebble Island. The ceasefire is only for a limited duration, and it is conceivable that fighting could start again, but considering the commanding position the British task force is now in, it does seem unthinkable.
Argentina's military junta issued a series of statements through the day to prepare people for bad news. Norman Rees in Buenos Aires reports on the build-up to tonight's announcement in Argentina.
Argentine defense forces had taken a battering all day during a heavy British offensive launched on 3 fronts at 10:30 last night. The military junta, after first saying that their troops were putting up fierce resistance, issued a communique this morning confirming that 2 key Argentine positions at Mount Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge had fallen under the British onslaught. British troops were now less than 4 kilometers from Port Stanley. Military sources here say that it was after this that the commander of the British troops on the islands, Major General Jeremy Moore, flashed a message to his Argentine counterpart suggesting a meeting. The Argentine commander and military governor of the Falklands, Brigadier General Mario Menendez, who had earlier predicted a crushing defeat for Britain, delayed his reply while he consulted with the military junta in Buenos Aires. Eventually, he was given permission to go ahead as long as the honor of Argentine soldiers wasn't compromised. Meanwhile, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in what could be an attempt to prepare people here for the worst, issued another communique saying that British forces continued to gain ground and that Argentine soldiers were faced with superior numbers, equipment, and technology. No details of the battlefield meeting between Major General Moore and General Menendez have emerged, except that it took place at 4 o'clock local time, that's 8 o'clock this evening in London, and that during the talks an informal ceasefire was observed. Military sources here say that General Menendez may now be on his way to Buenos Aires to convey the results of the meeting to the military junta, and that the ceasefire will continue until 2 o'clock London time tomorrow to give him chance to return to the front. It's believed here that nothing has been formally signed between the two sides, but Argentine military sources are saying two things. First, that a British victory in the battle for Port Stanley is now inevitable, and secondly, that to continue to offer resistance will lead to further very heavy loss of life. Given the makeup of the military junta, nothing can be certain here tonight, but it is beginning to look as if Argentina may well be considering surrender. Norman Rees, News at 10 in Buenos Aires.
Intercepted radio transmissions from Port Stanley to the Argentine mainland had indicated that conditions behind the Argentine lines were bad. But as John Snow reported from Chile, the broadcasts now appear to have been cut off altogether.
Throughout the crisis, two open radio shortwave links have existed between Port Stanley and the Argentine mainland. For the most part, Argentine troops have used them to speak to their relatives at home. Yesterday, sons and husbands were talking in depressed tones to their loved ones in Buenos Aires, an unhappy insight into the human tragedy of the war. On Friday night, in particular, they said they had suffered terribly. One man told his father he'd be home in 2 weeks. Then, for the first time on Sunday, we heard the normal domestic radio traffic interrupted by military commanders openly asking for further assistance. One officer speaking of the desperate need for an item codenamed 1701, warning that conditions were now so bad that it would now probably never be delivered. His last words were, "I must go now, the power is failing." From that time, more than 24 hours ago, the line has been dead and there has been no verbal contact. This morning, only teletyped, coded transmissions were reaching the mainland from Argentine troops in Port Stanley. Bunches of 5-letter combinations which have to be unscrambled by a computer and which can be transmitted by battery-run portable radios. 4 hours ago, even these messages ceased. We have scoured every frequency we have ever monitored the Argentines using, and every one is silent. John Snow, News at 10, Punta Arenas, southern Chile.
Now let's go over live to Glyn Mathias in Westminster for the latest details on Mrs Thatcher's speech to the Commons.
Well, Mrs Thatcher was greeted with loud cheers by the MPs in the Commons tonight as she brought them what she called the latest information from the Battle of the Falklands. After successes last night on the battlefield, she said General Moore had decided to press forward, and Mrs Thatcher spoke of large numbers of Argentine soldiers throwing down their weapons and white flags flying over Port Stanley. British troops, she said, had been told not to fire except in self-defence, and talks were now in progress with General Menendez, the Argentine commander in Port Stanley, over the surrender of Argentine troops in both East and West Falklands. Well, this statement was greeted with loud cheers by the Commons, who were relieved that the conflict had ended at last, and relieved it had ended so suddenly and in such a dramatic way. The Labour leader, Mr Michael Foot, joined in the congratulations. He said the news would bring widespread and genuine rejoicing that there would now be an end to the bloodshed. Mr Foot admitted he'd had his differences and arguments with Mrs Thatcher over the Falklands conflict, but he said he well understood the anxieties and pressures on Mrs Thatcher over the past few weeks, and he congratulated the Prime Minister that those anxieties and pressures had now been relieved. Well, the Liberal leader, Mr Steele, and Dr David Owen for the Social Democrats also joined in the congratulations to the government on the outcome of this conflict, and MPs go home tonight much happier and more relieved than they've been for many weeks past. Glyn Mathias, News at 10, Westminster.
It was only earlier tonight that the Ministry of Defence named 57 British servicemen killed or missing in fighting in the Falklands recently. The list includes the 50 men who were killed when the Argentines attacked the British landing ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram a week ago. This latest picture from the Falklands shows survivors of both ships coming ashore. Most of the men killed on the Sir Galahad were Welsh guards. Those who survived and journalists at the scene paid tribute to rescues carried out by helicopter crews. The helicopters hovered low over the water in dense smoke to blow fumes away from men trying to escape in life rafts.
The first pictures of British reoccupation of Goose Green have arrived in London. They show the burial of 18 paratroopers, including Colonel H, a special report in Part 2. Also in Beirut, the Israelis say they've cut off 5,000 Palestinian guerrillas. In a couple of minutes.
Film of Goose Green, shot immediately after its recapture by the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. Our reporter with the battalion, Jeremy Hands, saw the destruction, the fight to save the wounded, and the poignant funeral ceremony for the 17 Britons who died, including the paratroops commander, Colonel H. Jones.
At first light, the full extent of the horror of the fighting became apparent. The thick gorse that had hidden Argentine bunkers was still ablaze or smoking after what had been a furious battle. Some of the Argentine wounded huddled together in the burnt-out brush, exhausted, shocked and bemused, beyond caring about pain from their injuries. As the smoke and mist curled around them, it was impossible to feel anything but pity for them. Some died as they waited, the first aid offered quickly by the paratroopers not coming in time. The worst of the wounded were ferried back to the British military hospital as quickly as helicopters could be released to carry them. Men who'd been trying to kill each other less than an hour before now joined together to help the wounded. This, when air raids permits, is where the wounded come. An old and decaying refrigeration plant where doctors from the British Army and Navy deal with the horrors caused by bombs, bullets and burning. One doctor described the work rate as similar to the combined efforts of all the hospitals in Belfast during the worst weeks of the Troubles. And he added wryly that it had been brought home the reality of the American MASH TV series. As we filmed, Argentines suffering from burns were being treated. The patients past caring about the battle for the Falklands found their British doctors just as efficient and determined to patch them up as they would be for any British casualty, something the Argentines at first seemed quite surprised about. More casualties arrived, suffering from mortar shrapnel, the rough details about the incident being extracted through the language barrier before treatment.
¿Cuándo 10? ¿Cuándo 10? Dos días. 2 days ago. Mortar? Yeah. Yeah, can you just ask if it's just the one? Is it just the one injury?
Solamente este. ¿Tiene más? No. No, no es aquí la cara. Aquí solamente este.
The proud boast of the medical team here was that every patient who arrived alive went out alive. And I spoke to the man who'd set up the hospital, Surgeon Commander Rick Jolly.
Commander, what's been the major problem in setting up a medical facility like this on shore?
The fact is that normally with hospitals you have lots of clean areas and lots of space and lots of light. All we've had here is a refrigeration plant that's been disused for the last 30 years. But we had to take it, it was dry, and we simply got on with it.
Now, how successful has it been?
Well, we hope always in war that we're never busy at all, but we have been busy, as you know. The casualties have come in large numbers in 3 separate incidents. And I won't give you any figures, but I'm proud to say that thanks to the combined efforts of the naval surgeons and the army surgeons and the Royal Marines that support them, everyone that's come in here alive, despite their horrible wounds, has gone out alive, and they're now in Uganda.
Inevitably, at an occasion like this, there have been many lessons learned because it's never been done quite like this before. What were the major ones for you?
Well, the lessons learned are flexibility and good humor and a willingness to work. And if we had to do this again, I'd like the same team, and I'd like just a few more stores so that we didn't have to worry about running out of stores with casualties still waiting to be treated.
But so far the casualties haven't had to wait too long, have they?
Absolutely. Even the enemy we've operated on during the night when the air attacks have ceased. The other interesting thing is, of course, we've got 2 unexploded bombs in the building, but we've lived with those for so long now we've almost forgotten about them. I've just been to look at one and, well, the less said about that, the better.
For the civilians, their release hadn't come a moment too soon, and they showed it. For 29 days, they'd been kept in a small community hall, all 114 of them, often without hot food or sanitary arrangements. Now they were free to welcome the paras before starting up their lives again, and it was a welcome much appreciated by both sides. And then, much later on, a lonely hillside overlooking San Carlos water was the position for the funeral of the British. It was a somber, formal and moving event. 18 men laid to rest 8,000 miles from home. Their colleagues mourned and prayed there wouldn't be many more.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Wood, Captain Dent, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman, Corporal Sullivan, Corporal Fryer, Lance Corporal Cork, Lance Corporal Smith, Lance Corporal Bingley, Private Holman Smith, Private Fletcher, Private Illingsworth, Private Meakin, Private Dixon. From 3 Commando Brigade Air Squadron, Lieutenant Nunn. From 5-9 Commando Royal Engineers, Corporal Melia.
The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen. Amen.
The camera crew with Jeremy Hands are Bob Hammond and John Martin.
Here in Britain, a Harrier pilot from the task force has been talking about the air battle over the Falklands. Lieutenant Commander Tony Ogilvie, who's back in Britain because of an ear infection, took part in the first air raid on Port Stanley Airfield in May. He led 4 Harriers from HMS Hermes on a mission to knock out Argentine anti-aircraft defences. At a Ministry of Defence press conference, he spoke of the role of the Harriers and the opposition from the Argentine Air Force.
The job of the Harrier has been predominantly protection of the ships in the AOA, the amphibious operating area, and the Sound itself. And if you think of the number of aircraft involved by the Argentinians, on their big days they put over 35 raids across the island. That's possibly up to 70 or 80 aircraft in a day. Then, given that we can put, and we did, fly the aircraft to the limits, the ships in the Sound producing the best they've got, and they have got some superb close-range missiles, someone is going to get through.
Later, Ray Maloney asked Tony Ogilvie about the missiles being used in the fighting.
I think that there are a number of missiles that are coming out head and shoulders above the overall level of fighting. The Sidewinder missile we're using, the Seawolf missile that the Navy's employing on the Type 22, and indeed the Sea Dart battery, and also from the Argentinians' side, the Exocet missile are proving very, very lethal indeed.
More lethal than people had expected them to be.
I think the Sidewinder's kill ratio and the rate of success is quite staggering. I think some of the after effects of an Exocet missile attack hadn't possibly been realized before we were struck by them, to the extent at which a missile of that size can do damage to, or indeed incapacitate a ship with such things as choking smoke and the rapid movement of smoke throughout an entire ship. There are lessons being learnt by the minute down there, obviously, but indeed lethality of the weapons, the ones that are actually making the hits, is quite...
This is the News at 1 from ITN with Peter Sissons.
Hello, good afternoon. The Union Jack flies again over Port Stanley, just 10 weeks and 3 days after invading Argentine troops pulled it down. And after the Argentine surrender, 14,000 prisoners are now in British hands, 11,000 of them in the island's capital alone, far more than most estimates. The Queen has let it be known she is delighted and relieved. She's very pleased and proud of the courage, determination and professionalism of the servicemen and all those involved. She'd been particularly saddened by the tragic losses, and it had been brought home to her day by day that her own son was with the task force. So, in an extended News at One, a graphic first-hand account of the final fight and Argentine collapse. After last night's jubilation at Westminster, Mrs. Thatcher meets her cabinet to consider Britain's next moves, and recriminations and uncertainty in the Argentine capital. But first, the last hours of Argentine rule in the Falklands. Michael Nicholson came through a short time ago with a story of British heroism in days of fierce combat by Gurkhas, Guards, Paras and Marines, battling uphill in the blizzards of a Falklands winter. He tells of the Argentines running in retreat and of the silence which led to the realization dawning that the enemy had given up. Here's Michael Nicholson's dispatch.
The surrender document was issued last night by Major General Jeremy Moore, Commander Land Forces, and reads as follows. In Port Stanley at 9 p.m. tonight, 14th of June 1982, Major General Menendez surrendered to me all Argentine forces in East and West Falklands, together with their impedimenta. Arrangements are in hand to assemble them for their return to Argentina, to gather their arms and equipment, and to mark and make safe their munitions. The Falkland Islands are once again under the government desired by their inhabitants. God save the Queen. And it was signed Major General J.J. Moore. General Moore flew into Stanley at 8 o'clock last night from his headquarters in Fitzroy, and the surrender was concluded and the surrender document signed at 1 o'clock this morning, British time. The Argentine flag that was flying over the governor's house, which had been General Menendez's headquarters, was hauled down, and the Union Jack is now flying in its place. The signing of the surrender was the conclusion of 4 days of intensive fighting as British troops leapfrogged towards the tiny capital that was the Argentines' headquarter garrison. And whatever else has been said about the Argentine troops, they put up a fight to defend their positions. Yesterday, I was there at the end to witness the final attack on the Argentines' last defense of Stanley, a hill called Mount Sapa. To get to it, our troops had to fight their way to 2 other hills, Mount Tumbledown and Mount William. And after 13 hours of battle, and under incessant artillery and mortar fire, men of the 2nd Parachute Battalion, men of the Scots Guards, and men of the Gurkha Rifles swept up Sapa Hill with Argentine soldiers running, and I mean running from their trenches along the ridge, past Sapa Hill and down the slopes on the other side into Stanley. The 2nd Paras were swooping down off Wireless Ridge, the Scots Guards off Tumbledown, and the Gurkhas off William. It was a sight never to be forgotten, and an end to a night of fighting I hope never again to have to witness. I saw the Scots Guards take up their positions among the rocks of Mount Harriet, 2 miles back from the Argentine lines. It was just before dusk. Their objective was Mount Tumbledown, a long sloping hill covered in shale and rock and covered with Argentine heavy machine gun posts and mortar positions. The Gurkhas began their move left of us, around the side of the valley. Their objective was to wait until the Guards had taken Tumbledown and then to sweep around them to take Mount William. Immediately, Argentine artillery hidden behind the hills began shelling us. A constant barrage of 105 and 155 millimeter guns. And we crouched behind rocks, pushed ourselves into trenches as we heard the whistle of the shells coming at us. Behind us, our own artillery, our own field guns began their thumping. 12 guns firing into the slopes of the hills ahead, at the Argentine positions. Under this umbrella, the Scots Guards began running forward, using the rocks as cover as the Argentine machine guns began sweeping backwards and forwards across the plain that separated the two armies. Although it was dark, with no moon shining, Argentine flares lit up the sky, so that for much of the time it was almost daylight. At one point, it must have been about 3 o'clock in the morning, it began to snow heavily. And it wasn't long before the flares showed up our own men moving across the plain, sharply defined in their dark camouflage against the white of the snow. But despite the snow, despite the machine gun fire, despite the mortars and artillery, they inched their way forward, lying flat in the snow, hardly moving as each barrage of shells landed around them. At one time, our own artillery stopped firing. We'd heard aircraft overhead, Argentine aircraft, probably looking for the muzzle flashes of our field guns to drop their bombs on. So for those minutes, and they seemed very long minutes, we were without our own protective shell fire. And there was another hazard. Knowing that our men were now spread out across the plain, Argentine artillery began using airburst shells. These are shells that explode only feet above the ground, spraying their shrapnel hundreds of yards around us. We took casualties from these shells and from the mortars that I watched dropping around us. The mortars that give no warning of their approach, unlike the shells, just the sudden explosion and the spray of the dreadful shrapnel. This is how it sounded. But there was no stopping the British advance. Around to the left of us, on the other side of a mountain called Two Sisters on Wireless Ridge, were the men of the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. They were advancing in parallel with us, the 2nd Paras, the men who took Darwin and Goose Green, the men who lost their CO in the taking of it, the men who we all knew meant to be the first into Stanley. And by the time it was beginning to get light, it was still snowing, it was all over but the shouting. Along the ridge that led into Stanley, we could see the tiny dots of Argentine troops running from their positions, throwing down their guns, running out of our sight down the slopes on the other side that was Stanley. And as proof that our troops were now established on the peaks of Mount Stumbledown and William, I watched our helicopters begin flying ammunitions up to them. And then, shortly afterwards, the procession of small army scout helicopters hovering over the battlefield and around the rocks, searching for our casualties. We waited for more artillery. We waited for more air attacks. We waited for something, anything to happen. But except for the drone of the helicopters, it was all quiet. And then all of us, standing on the top of our own little mountain, looking down into Stanley, began to think of a possibility, a rather marvelous possibility. Maybe they, the Argentinians, had given up. For hours we waited, not knowing, just watching Stanley. We watched the buildings close to the waterfront on fire, areas that the Argentinians had been using for their artillery, areas that had been hit by Harrier air attacks and by our own guns. We saw the Argentine hospital ship, the Praiza, come into the harbor. We watched the airstrip for movement, but there was none. Nothing seemed to move. And then, at 5 to 4 in the afternoon, our company commander came out of his trench with the news.
Now that the white flag is flying over Stanley.
Is there a white flag flying? There is a white flag flying over Stanley.
Bloody marvelous.
Bloody marvelous, he said, and he meant it. And that's how we all heard it. The fighting has stopped, and our war, here at least, is over. Michael Nicholson, News at 1, with the British forces on the Falkland Islands.
And now those forces are faced by a number of operational and organisational tasks, including guarding the Argentine prisoners, who outnumber them by more than 2 to 1. The Ministry of Defence say nearly 15,000, in fact, Argentine soldiers have surrendered. The British forces add up to about 6,000. This from our defence correspondent, Geoffrey Archer.
As dawn breaks in the Falklands in an hour or two, the task will begin in earnest to organize the defeated Argentine soldiers into groups to ship them off the islands back to Argentina. The key to the victory yesterday was the battle for those hills round Stanley. First came the capture of Two Sisters Ridge, then came the seizure of Tumbledown Mount, Sapper Hill, and Wireless Ridge to the north. All fought for fiercely, with casualties on both sides. The British artillery fire, which played a key part in that battle, was described by Brian Hanrahan.
It was a battle of light and sound. First, the thunder of artillery, throwing shell after shell, hundreds, no, thousands, whistling down the valley to explode with a dull crump among the Argentine defences. After several hours of bombardment, with each shell sending up a burst of flame on the mountain, the ground forces moved in. The rattle of heavy machine guns, the explosions of the mortars, occasionally in pauses the sound of men shouting somewhere down in the darkness. In the distance I could hear the more regular thud of naval guns, adding their weight to the bombardment. The ships alone fired 900 shells that night.
Kicking off at 11:20. That's the new lineup for the rest of this evening on BBC One, which begins now with the 9 o'clock news and Falklands special introduced by David Dimbleby.
Good evening. At 1 o'clock this morning, the Argentine commander in Port Stanley surrendered. On this day of triumph for the British forces, we'll be looking in this extended news and Falklands special at what happens now that victory is won. The Defence Secretary, John Knott, is here with me in the studio, and other guests will be joining Richard Lindley and myself later in the programme as we examine the lessons to be learned from the last 10 weeks. But to start with, the 9 o'clock news with John Humphreys.
We have restored once again the dominance of Britain, and let every nation know that where is British sovereign territory, it will be well and truly defended, and we shall never again be the victim of aggression.
The day the British liberated the Falklands and the islanders said thank you. The day 13,000 Argentines surrendered. And the day thousands more showed their anger at defeat and their grief. Good evening. A day of peace on the Falkland Islands. And by tonight, British troops have begun the task of disarming the enemy, whose defeat came so suddenly and so completely. The scale of the British victory became apparent this afternoon, when Mrs. Thatcher told the Commons more than 13,000 Argentines were taken prisoner today, 11,000 of them in Port Stanley alone. Our correspondent says there's been extensive destruction in the tiny capital, and there's great concern over how to look after all the prisoners. They're said to be in a sorry state, many of them suffering from exposure and badly in need of medical care. More than 700 Argentines have died, and the final total of British dead will be around 250. They died that others might live in freedom and justice, said Mrs. Thatcher. She said Mr. Rex Hunt, Governor of the Falklands, will soon be going back, but administering the islands alongside him will be General Moore, in charge of military matters, the man who received the Argentine surrender. Britain is now asking Argentina to agree that the end of the fighting on the Falklands means a complete end to hostilities between the two countries. That was announced by Mrs. Thatcher in the Commons soon after she'd paid this tribute to the British forces.
The Battle of the Falklands was a remarkable military operation, boldly planned, bravely executed, and brilliantly accomplished. We owe an enormous debt to the British forces and to the Merchant Marine. We honor them all. They have been supported by a people united in defense of our way of life and of our sovereign territory. Yeah.
The formal announcement of the Argentine surrender was sent to London in a message from the British commander, Major General Jeremy Moore. It said in Port Stanley at 9 p.m. Falklands time tonight, the 14th of June, Major General Menendez surrendered all Argentine armed forces in East and West Falklands, together with their impedimenta. The Falkland Islands are once more under the government desired by their inhabitants. God save the Queen. Brian Hanrahan was with British troops overlooking Stanley when the Argentine resistance finally ended.
The Argentinians now appear to be on the retreat. They have left Tumbledown Mountain. They are pulling out of Mount William, which is under severe attack. There is a bombardment going on at the moment. I can see smoke rising up from the fall of shell. And they're also pulling out, we're told, from Sapper Hill, which is the last hill before Port Stanley. And in the distance I can see Port Stanley with the smoke coming from fires. There's a ship in the harbour and the occasional flash of flame. It really does look like the end. There are people withdrawing from the mountain in great numbers, being helped on their way by this thunderous British bombardment.
I just heard that the white flag is flying over Stanley. Is that all right? I just heard that the white flag is flying over Stanley.
Later, our reporter Robert Fox entered Port Stanley with the British Commander General Moore. Here's his report.
Towards evening, we saw Stanley. Fires burning from several parts of the town. Over 100 had taken refuge from the shelling and bombing in the West Store. He was hugged and kissed by the women, old and young, and children. They sang for He's a Jolly Good Fellow, and the loyal toast to the Queen was proposed, the tins of beer glinting in the candlelight. At the hospital, he met the doctors and nurses who had tended the sick and injured over the last 2 months. There were words of comfort and condolence for young Steve Whittley, whose wife was killed in the bombardment a few days ago. Out in the streets, the Argentinians stood round quietly. Some set light to a store on the wharf and watched while small arms ammunition exploded. Several of us ran down the street to try to rouse other Argentinians sleeping there, to get them away and remove more ammunition. Discipline has been breaking down between Argentinian officers and men. One eyewitness, Alison King, saw conscripts turn on their officers and machine gun houses in the east of the town. Some 70 houses have been systematically looted. Throughout the night, Argentinian military police patrolled, driving vehicles on the right, while the newly freed settlers insisted on driving on the left. The complete surrender took barely a few hours. Immediately afterwards, General Moore told me of his surprise and delight at the outcome.
I'm not surprised at all. Because of the kind of men you've been commanding? Because of the superb quality of the men I've been commanding, whose training is excellent, whose determination you've seen, whose drive and energy in very, very difficult conditions up there in the mountains. Hard weather, hard country, and a determined enemy have made it a jolly hard slog for them, and you've seen them. They've marched from the far end of this island right to this end of it, and they're as fit and ready to go as ever.
Within hours of the British victory at Port Stanley, more details of the final collapse by the Argentines emerged in London. At a news conference at the Ministry of Defence, the Deputy to the Commander-in-Chief of Operations described the decisive British action which led to the Argentine retreat. And he then announced just how many Argentine troops had been in and around Port Stanley.
We now know that in the Port Stanley area there were some 11,000 troops. And in the Falkland Islands as a whole, the total enemy strength was over 16,000. And in capturing Port Stanley, our own people fought at odds of 2 to 1 against. And if you remember that classically speaking, to carry out attack, a commander would like to have 3 of his own troops to every troop of the enemy. That is a very considerable feat indeed.
A considerable military feat which has left General Moore and Admiral Woodward with a major headache. What to do with all those prisoners of war? The Argentine surrender came just in time to prevent heavy bloodshed amongst the Argentines. The 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, had fought their way down as far as the racecourse. To their left were the Gurkhas, 45 Commando and 3 Para. To the right were 4-2 Commando, the 2nd Battalion, the Scots Guards, the 1st Battalion, the Welsh Guards, and 40 Commando, Royal Marines. 2 full brigades storming in to take what they thought was a defending force of 7,000 men. Instead, they found 11,000, all of them cold and hungry, and many suffering from exposure and frostbite. It's meant the task force have a huge logistical problem, for they have to provide everyone with food, warmth and shelter, and when the Atlantic conveyor was sunk, she went down with nearly 5,000 tents. The sheer number of prisoners had astounded the British. When General Moore brought in his own reserve a fortnight ago, he thought he had achieved a military balance. The harbour at San Carlos Water 2 weeks ago. In the bay, a cluster of ships laden down with stores for the British beachhead. Unable to move, they were sitting ducks for the Argentine Air Force. But out in Falklands Sound, the Royal Navy's gun line was holding, and the Argentines didn't even realize there had been a second landing. So the stores poured in, thousands of tons of food, ammunition and weapons, and thousands of men. These were the Gurkha Rifles. They'd come out in the QE2, changed ships in South Georgia, and then sailed to San Carlos. Ashore, the patrols were bringing in Argentine prisoners. First they were searched, then they waited, watched by curious groups of Falklanders. Finally, they were held in a makeshift tented prison cage. The ground between San Carlos Water and Teal Inlet, 50 miles northeast, was said to be virtually impassable on foot. The paratroops and commandos proved the experts were wrong. The Marines called it yomping, the paras bashing. By any name, it was a forced march which made military history. Going on foot meant the helicopters could be released for the vital task of ferrying up stores. Every sortie had to be justified. The most important loads were the commando gunners' 105mm light guns. Slung beneath the Royal Navy's Sea Kings, the artillery was moved across broken, trackless country in minutes. The only cover was camouflage netting. Also darting around the Falklands by helicopter was the Land Forces commander, Major General Jeremy Moore. His only distinctive mark was his peaked cap, not enough of a giveaway to mark him as a target for a sniper. In the distance, the occasional bombing raid got through. Minutes later, the Kazivac helicopters would bring in the wounded. The final death toll of the Falklands War isn't yet known. Britain lost more than 200 lives, Argentina lost at least 700, possibly as many as 1,000. With the fighting now ended, the Defence Secretary, John Nott, is now facing some awkward questions from those who argue that it was his cuts in the Navy which led to the crisis in the first place. Today at a press conference, he announced a study which will last until the autumn.
We need to send people, scientists, weapon experts and others down there to study how all the weapon systems worked, what the problems were, whether we had the right weapon systems, and really it would be foolish, I think, to rush into it. I mean, there are some obvious points which come out straight away. Clearly, it would have been a help to us to have had an airborne early warning system. That's one of the points that has been widely made. Over the next few months, we must all study it and see what adjustments we need to make to our policy. I'm not going to try and hold firm to everything we've previously announced. We must learn the lessons of this affair and put them to good use.
Mr. Nott's reference to the lack of an airborne early warning radar system is a sore point with the Navy. Every one of the 7 British ships lost could have been saved if the attacking Argentine planes had been detected in time. In the old days, when the Royal Navy still had a conventional fixed-wing aircraft carrier, the old Ark Royal, she carried radar picket planes. The gannets were slow and ungainly, but the radar gave all-round cover for 100 miles, time enough to send up interceptors or to give course and speed information to warship missile systems. But gannets need catapults. They can't operate from Hermes or Invincible. It was a lesson which has been learned the hard way. The Navy have now given top priority to adapting helicopters to carry airborne early warning radars. There were other lessons. The Exocet missile has a unique radar signature, but because it's in NATO's service, the Royal Navy battle computers had Exocets registered as friendly weapons. They had to be modified urgently. But the greatest shock was the loss of so many ships to bombing attacks. It showed the Navy needs far more weaponry for self-defense. Missiles like the Seawolf and radar-controlled guns. They also need more ships. A minimum fleet strength of 50 frigates and destroyers is the figure being talked of in naval circles. Finally, it now seems clear that Mr. Nott's plan to sell HMS Invincible to Australia and make do with just 2 carriers in the fleet may have to be cancelled. The task force used a merchant ship, Atlantic Conveyor, as a makeshift emergency carrier, and she was sunk after less than a week in the war zone. All this means the Navy are going to demand that a lot of money is spent on their needs, and that cash will have to come from somewhere. Some senior Army officers are worried that Mr. Nott may decide on further cuts in the Rhine Army. If so, it will lead to a bitter inter-service row.
A triumphant Prime Minister told MPs this afternoon that there would be no Argentine involvement in the future of the Falklands. Britain's dominance had been restored, she said. And then she gave this warning: let every nation know that where there is British sovereign territory, it will be well and truly defended. There were loud cheers for Mrs. Thatcher at that, as there were late last night when she returned to Downing Street after telling MPs about the ceasefire.
We knew what we had to do. And we went about it and did it.
Do you think the ceasefire will hold, Prime Minister?
I believe so. I believe so. There's still 1 or 2 things. Just listen to everyone. I must go down and wave
Well done. Thank you.
The argument between the Prime Minister and Michael Foot is now about whether Britain can afford to go it alone, if necessary, over the Falklands' long-term future. Mrs. Thatcher, flushed by the task force's success, believes she can. Mr. Foot wants her to get international help. But the Prime Minister gave the United Nations short shrift this afternoon.
With regard to Resolution 502, may I continue to point out to the Right Honourable Gentleman, it was not honoured by the Argentine. It was not honoured. We had to secure the withdrawal without Resolution 502, and because it was not honoured, we do not need to negotiate in any way with the United Nations or anyone else about the British sovereignty of those islands, and may I make that absolutely clear.
But I do believe the government will have to turn its attention, much more than the Prime Minister appeared to be doing today, will have to turn its attention to the long-term future of the islands in which we will need assistance from some other countries.
What future do you see for the Argentine in those matters?
Well, I don't know what part they will play, but at any rate, we've got to discuss that with some of our allies. And we have had allies. They may not have done everything we wanted, but the Americans, for example, the United States, we've got to discuss it with them. Then there are many other countries on the United Nations, France and others, who supported us throughout. We have to discuss these matters with them, and it's very foolish for the government to take the view, if it does take the view, that we can just sail ahead without having any allies. We've wanted allies over the past 2 or 3 months, and we're going to need them all through the months and years ahead, and so are the people in the Falkland Islands.
After last night's delight, thoughts at Westminster are now turning to the inquest on what went wrong at the beginning of April. Mrs. Thatcher would like a narrow inquiry. The opposition parties who are being consulted will want to discover if any ministers are to blame. There's particular interest in uncovering the intelligence information that was available to Mrs. Thatcher herself. The black box a Prime Minister receives each Friday is said to be the most essential reading of the week. It contains a digest of the reports of what the intelligence community calls the Friends, that is, British agents abroad. 4 or 5 Privy Councillors will probably be set to find out why we lost the Falklands.
John Cole. Reports from Argentina tonight say that after the defeat in the Falklands, General Galtieri may not be in power much longer, possibly 2 more months at the most. Publicly, the junta will say only that there's been a ceasefire. The word surrender has not been mentioned. But the message has reached the people in Buenos Aires. They were on the streets tonight shouting treason and why did our young people die? Last night too the mood was angry and police had to use rubber truncheons. Clive Ferguson reporting.
The Argentine national anthem has been heard many times since the 2nd of April, but never in the circumstances it was being sung outside Government House last night. Few people had realistically expected Argentina to win. Now they were concerned that the country should not face ignominious defeat. The realization that that might be difficult to avoid created a mixture of emotions. But however vocal, the cry was the same: no surrender. That and the other slogans, don't sell the country, don't negotiate the Argentine blood that has been shed, they were all directed at the military junta. For all that, though, there was an acceptance that their troops would now have to leave the islands. But there was also a determination that this was not the end of the struggle and that Argentina would fight on.
This one is not the last battle of this war. We are going to fight to the death. And England must understand that we are going to fight the rest of our lives.
Officially, the media here has, from the moment things began to go against Argentina, been trying to put on a brave face. Last night's evening news was no exception. The seriousness of the situation was accepted, but there was no talk of surrender or even of the ceasefire. Instead, the presenter made much of the fact that Argentina had emerged from the fighting on the islands, a country united as never before. Throughout yesterday, people on the streets turned to the World Cup to distract them from news from the islands. Though even as they watched in TV shop windows, yet another official communique released more details of how badly the Argentine troops were faring. The Air Force Chief, Brigadier Lamidoso, arrived back from visiting his bases in the south of the country. In the most recent fighting, his section of the Argentine Armed Forces has suffered most. But he maintained that he was ready to continue the fight. And late last night, there were signs that he might prove the biggest obstacle to signing anything resembling a long-lasting ceasefire, because he, it was rumoured, was insisting that the army accept full responsibility for the Argentine defeat. And that might be difficult for the head of the army to accept, since he's also the president of the country.
As this dispute moves back into the diplomatic field, the British government are trying to find out, as a matter of some urgency, whether the surrender of Argentine forces on the islands indicates that Buenos Aires is agreeing to an unconditional cessation of all hostilities. Mrs. Thatcher wants an assurance that the Argentines will not continue to wage war against the Falklands from the mainland. Upon the answer to that question, posed through the Swiss embassy in Buenos Aires, will depend how many of the prisoners are returned. Unless she gets the assurance that armed conflict is at an end, Mrs. Thatcher will give the order to hold on to senior and specialist Argentine troops. As for the future of the island itself, the Governor Rex Hunt, who was thrown out by the Argentines wearing his plumed hat of office, is due to return in triumph. He accepts, though, that things will never be quite the same again.
Oh, I think materially things will be different, of course, because, I mean, to begin with, we'll have 4 times the island population there for a while as troops, and the rehabilitation will take some time, the rehabilitation and reconstruction. I think when I said I was optimistic about the future, things would be better, I think this is because the sovereignty dispute will not be hanging over our heads. It was the uncertainty of the sovereignty dispute that kept quite a lot of investment and I think quite a lot of people away from the islands, and perhaps sent a few of the islanders away from the islands. I think that after this, as long as the security of the islands can be guaranteed, then there will be more certainty and there will be more attraction to investment and to people coming in.
Mrs. Thatcher has ruled out any UN presence on the island in the foreseeable future. The islanders will be given a year or so to collect their thoughts, after which the Prime Minister envisages a multinational force there. But the United States has indicated that they will not support this force unless Britain finds some sort of role for Argentina in the discussions. In that case, says Mrs. Thatcher, we'll go it alone. She reckons that development of the island's sheep breeding, of the seaweed beds, of inshore and deep-sea fisheries, and of the export of meat can make the island a viable proposition. Some of her ministers, however, are hoping that time and perhaps a change of regime in Buenos Aires will persuade her to change her mind.
Now the Middle East. The relative calm that followed Friday's ceasefire has been broken tonight, with reports that Syrian and Palestinian troops have begun shelling Israeli tanks in Beirut. An Israeli report says